You stand at the threshold of a dark chamber, not of stone or earth, but of your own skull. A silent, starless void where thoughts flicker like dying embers and something ancient waits in the deepest shadows. What if the deepest historical horrors were not external acts, but echoes of a consciousness that was never truly ours? History whispers a darker truth, that this sacred chamber is a haunted landscape, a labyrinth where fear breeds, and the walls between sanity and the supernatural are terrifyingly thin. Tonight, we do not look outward into the darkness of the world, but inward into the chilling history of the mind that holds 100 unspeakable secrets. We begin with the primal breach, the first crack in the fortress of self. The historical phantom limb syndrome. Ancient physicians from Egypt to Rome recorded cases of missing limbs that still burned and ached with ghostly sensation, a phantom pain so vivid it drove soldiers and labourers to madness. They did not call it nerve damage, they called it the soul's betrayal, suggesting a part of the self remained eternally tethered to the physical world even after severance, a dark parallel to the afterlife where the body fails but the pain persists. This unsettling paradox shows the mind can fabricate sensory reality so completely that the body becomes irrelevant. The earliest known cures for this ghost affliction were rooted in ritualistic practices, believing the pain was caused by an offended spirit or an unquiet ancestor who had attached itself to the residual trauma. Shamans and healers performed intricate ceremonies near shadowed or haunted locations, attempting to coax the spirit from the nervous system by presenting symbolic imagery of peace and completion. The fact that many patients reported temporary relief suggests the cure was not physical but purely psychological, demonstrating the mind's astonishing ability to self-deceive. Perhaps the most chilling implication of the phantom limb is its connection to the series' central question. What if the suffering we experience is not a physical end, but a metaphysical open loop? This persistent, unresolvable pain mirrors humanity's inability to shake off certain recurring historical horrors, suggesting a flaw in our collective consciousness. It's an error in the fundamental wiring that keeps us eternally tethered to past trauma, much like a cursed object that continues to radiate malevolence, the low-frequency hum of a past that refuses to die. The Edict of Silent Fear. In 14th century Europe, during the height of the Black Death, records exist of remote villages enforcing an Edict of Silent Fear, a desperate measure born from the belief that vocalizing one's fear of the plague actually attracted the disease. This was a historically unique form of psychological warfare against the self. The terrified populace was forced to suppress all outward signs of dread, leading to widespread non-verbal hysteria where people collapsed not from fever, but from the unbearable psychological pressure of enforced silence and internal panic. This historical episode demonstrates a chilling truth. The mind can translate emotional suppression into physical collapse, blurring the line between psychosomatic illness and actual contagion. The forced silence created an echo chamber where private dread magnified into a collective, internal terror, making the populace uniquely vulnerable to psychological manipulation. It suggests that control over one's thoughts is an illusion, easily shattered by external enforcement and the natural human propensity to internalize fear until it manifests as a debilitating physical symptom. The Edict of Silent Fear stands as a dark monument to the vulnerability of the collective mind, a terrifying example of how shared belief, regardless of its truth, can become a weapon against the body. If entire villages could be paralyzed by the belief that their voices invited death, what hidden terrors might we still be internalizing today? It makes one question the integrity of collective consciousness and suggests that it is not a strength, but merely a larger, more fragile vessel for ancient unspoken fears, a nexus point for the series' supernatural influences. The myth of the animus tenebris. Ancient Greek philosophers, particularly those with mystical leanings, posited the existence of the animus tenebris, the shadow soul, a second, non-rational consciousness within every individual that only truly woke during madness, intense ritual, or prophetic trance. This shadow soul was not just the unconscious, it was seen as a primal, horrifying reservoir of inherited violence and ancient bestial urges, the hidden horrors of the human condition. They believed this aspect was what allowed otherwise moral people to commit atrocities under the influence of panic or crowd behaviour, absolving them of responsibility but not of the consequence. Historical accounts of mass killings often describe perpetrators acting with a cold, almost inhuman detachment, suggesting the temporary dominance of this shadow soul. The Greeks saw this as evidence of the mind's essential duality, a thin layer of reason covering a boiling reservoir of darkness, perpetually ready to breach. They developed specific agonizing rituals intended to appease or exhaust the animus tenebris, believing that by voluntarily facing a small dose of terror, one could prevent the full, catastrophic awakening of this primal entity, a perverse attempt to control the source of inherited violence. The concept of the shadow soul perfectly encapsulates the series' theme of hidden horrors and the persistence of fear across time. If the primal evil is literally coded into our very consciousness, waiting only for a moment of stress or an external supernatural influence to awaken, then human history is merely the chronicling of its episodic outbursts. This elevates every historical massacre, every moment of societal collapse, from a political failure to a profound, intrinsic and deeply terrifying biological flaw. The human mind is merely a ticking clock toward the next episode of self-destruction. The historical records of glossolalia epidemics, medieval monasteries and convents throughout the 15th and 16th centuries recorded bizarre sudden epidemics of glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, where dozens of nuns or monks would suddenly begin shrieking ancient forgotten dialects or languages that did not exist. Contemporary chroniclers believed these were not divine gifts, but evidence of mass demonic possession or a catastrophic breakdown of shared reality, a chilling case of the mind manufacturing language from internal chaos. The sounds were often described as unsettlingly rhythmic, like a corrupted ritual, suggesting the intrusion of the supernatural influences directly into the linguistic centres of the brain. The phenomenon was highly contagious, spreading through earshot and visual exposure, a potent demonstration of the mind's sheer suggestibility. Those afflicted reported feeling their own thoughts being overwritten by a foreign aggressive consciousness, an experience of absolute mental colonization. Exorcisms and physical restraints were the only known treatments, confirming that medieval thinkers viewed this as a physical manifestation of a spiritual virus, the mind being turned into a hostile vessel or a breeding ground for whispers of ancient fears. The fear was not just of the sounds, but of the loss of self-control. These glossolalia epidemics present a dark answer to the question of the boundary between myth and reality, demonstrating that the mind can manifest the mythological. If a group consciousness can collectively invent a demonic language and force others to speak it, what other terrifying constructs are lurking in the historical unconscious, waiting for the right moment of stress to become real? The silence that followed these outbreaks was the most terrifying thing of all, a lingering quiet over the knowledge that the self is an open, porous structure, an easy host for any invading darkness. The cult of voluntarily forgotten memories. A dark, esoteric cult operating secretly in the margins of the Roman Empire believed that true immortality was only achieved by completely and voluntarily forgetting one's mortal life. They practiced ritualistic self-hypnosis and deep meditation in ancient crypts, aiming to erase all personal memory, a complete dissolution of the self, in order to access an ancient mind where all forgotten truths of the universe resided. This was a profound, terrifying historical experiment in self-erasure, treating personal memory not as a treasure, but as a cage holding back universal consciousness. Historical fragments describe the cult members eventually achieving a terrifying form of collective, non-personal consciousness, speaking only in pronouncements and archaic knowledge that was irrelevant to their previous lives. They had successfully dissolved their individual selves, but in doing so, they became walking vessels for fragmented, potentially malevolent, universal memories. This suggests that the ultimate hidden horror is the dissolution of the personal self, leaving behind an empty shell that can be filled by any passing supernatural influence or ancient non-human consciousness. The dark implication for the series is that the central question, what dark forces or forgotten truths connect the creepiest moments of human history, may lead to the discovery that the dark force is not actively seeking us, but is simply the residual energy of the cosmos, ready to fill any void created by a dissolved human mind. The cult's actions prove that the mind can be consciously erased to allow access to terrifying knowledge. It is the human mind voluntarily opening the open loops to a cosmic, eternal, and non-personal horror. The history of shared dream landscapes. Medieval folklore is rife with tales of dream journeys, where multiple individuals reported experiencing the exact same bizarre, frightening landscapes and encounters on the same night. These were not mere coincidences, but historical evidence of a perceived shared consciousness, a psychic tethering that could link the minds of sleeping villagers to a terrifying, non-physical plane of existence. The dreamscape was often described as a dark, mist-choked forest or an impossibly tall ruined structure, always containing the motif of a watchful, shadowed eye. The unsettling uniformity of these reports suggests the mind may not be as private as we believe. The elders and priests viewed these incidents with extreme dread, seeing them as incursions of a supernatural influence or a mass demonic summoning performed unconsciously by the sleepers. Their greatest fear was not the dream itself, but the possibility that the dream entity could pass commands or dark knowledge to all minds simultaneously, leading to coordinated acts of horror. This shared unconscious vulnerability was countered with communal ritual, particularly the lighting of countless candles to represent the interplay of light and darkness, pushing back the night's influence. These historical dream reports align chillingly with the central question, suggesting that the unifying factor behind history's horrors is a shared, non-physical plane accessed by the sleeping mind. If an entity can program 100 dreams with the same horrifying scenario, it implies the darkest acts in human history may have been coordinated from a spiritual dimension, a form of psychic, premeditated attack. The mind, in its most vulnerable state, may be the bridge between the world of men and the world of ancient forgotten forces, a perpetually open loop for intrusion. The historical dangers of nostalgia. Historical physicians, particularly during periods of intense social unrest or long wars, documented a condition they termed mal d'antiquité, the sickness of the past. It was a crippling form of nostalgia, where the mind became so acutely fixated on a flawless, idealized memory of a past time that it rejected the present reality entirely, leading to atrophy and sometimes death. This historical sickness suggests the mind's terrifying capacity to prefer a perfect fiction over a difficult truth. They believed this condition weakened the soul's defenses, making the patient vulnerable to the supernatural influences that thrive on despair and mental withdrawal. This extreme historical melancholy was treated not with comfort, but with harsh confrontation, sometimes involving public shaming or forced exposure to the present-day reality of war or famine. The doctors reasoned that only a shock to the system could break the mind's dangerous obsession with its own false history. This aggressive treatment reveals an ancient understanding of the mind's fragility, that a persistent, pleasant delusion is far more dangerous than any outward horror. The mind, in its self-deceptive state, creates an open loop for its own destruction by prioritizing comfort over truth. The implication for our continuous narrative is that history itself, the way we remember it, may be a mass-produced mal d'antiquité, a collective, idealized fiction created by our minds to cope with the actual terror of the past. We willingly forget the inconvenient horrors, opening the collective consciousness to the intrusion of ancient powers that benefit from our complacency and mental withdrawal. The hidden horrors are forgotten not by accident, but by a self-imposed, lethal desire for a simpler, gentler, and utterly false history. The myth of the unspoken word. Many Slavic and Norse folklore traditions speak of the unspoken word, a terrifying concept that holds that any thought held in the mind with sufficient malicious intent becomes a tangible entity in the non-physical realm. This entity, a phantom of pure thought, acts as an autonomous agent of the thinker's will, spreading misfortune, sickness, and inherited violence across generations. The only defense was to voice the dark thought immediately, thereby reducing its power and preventing the creation of an eternal, parasitic mental form. This belief reveals an historical fear of thought pollution. The historical impact of this myth was profound. It resulted in communities actively encouraging the immediate ritualistic confession of all dark thoughts, no matter how small or shameful. This constant public self-disclosure, while seemingly cleansing, also served as a mass psychological control mechanism, ensuring that the collective consciousness remained transparent and unpolluted by hidden horrors. It was a preventative measure against a purely mental plague, suggesting that the line between thought and action is not a moral one, but a physical one, easily breached by the mind's power. This terrifying concept gives literal shape to the whispers of ancient fears, suggesting that the horrors we investigate are not just echoes, but autonomous, self-sustaining entities created by the malicious thoughts of our ancestors. The collective unspoken words of 1,000 generations are now a physical, powerful force in the spiritual world, actively working to fulfill their original intent. The human mind is therefore not just an observer of history, but a manufacturer of its own eternal monsters, an endless open loop of creation and consequence. The historical connection of madness and prophecy. Throughout ancient history, from the Oracle of Delphi to the ecstatic prophets of medieval European sects, severe psychological instability was often mistaken for, or deliberately framed as, a divine gift. Madness, characterized by profound delusion or extreme dissociation, was seen as a temporary opening of the mind to a larger timeless truth, proving the boundary between myth and reality was porous. The prophet was merely a vessel, his mind breached and overwritten by divine or demonic knowledge, turning the most terrifying mental state into a respected, if feared, profession. This perception meant that historical figures displaying symptoms we now recognize as severe psychosis were instead revered, their terrifying rants and irrational visions guiding the fate of nations and armies. The willingness of entire societies to follow the dictates of a disordered mind demonstrates a fundamental cultural instability, an intrinsic belief that the truth is so terrifying it can only be delivered through a broken vessel. It shows that the mind is highly susceptible to the authority of a voice that appears to access forgotten truths regardless of its stability. The mind's ultimate betrayal, as revealed by the prophet, is its ability to turn internal chaos into external, accepted order. If society is willing to accept prophecy born of madness, what hidden commands are we still following today that were born of a psychic breach centuries ago? The prophecy is the purest historical example of the mind being used as a weapon, with the supernatural influences finding their path into human affairs by simply exploiting the perceived sacredness of mental dysfunction, leading to mass delusion. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae. The Roman Senate's chilling act of damnatio memoriae, the formal condemnation of memory, was perhaps the most terrifying historical acknowledgement of the mind's power. It was the practice of systematically erasing a person from all historical and civic record, scraping their name from monuments, erasing them from official documents, and destroying their statues. The goal was to eliminate the very concept of the person from the collective human consciousness, condemning the individual to a terror far worse than death. Absolute, permanent mental non-existence. This historical policy was an attempt to control the consciousness of the future, a terrifying acknowledgement that true power lay not in killing the body, but in annihilating the mind's ability to recall a life. The Romans understood that memory is the essence of survival, and by enforcing the complete and utter dissolution of the personal self, they could prevent the subject from becoming a spiritual or political threat. The effort required was immense, suggesting a deep, almost superstitious belief in the political power of a thought, or lack thereof, in the collective mind. The failure of damnatio memoriae is the most unsettling fact. The very act of condemning the memory ensured that the historical record must mention the act of erasure, creating a permanent, haunting void. This void acts as a massive open loop in the collective mind, a place where the consciousness of the erased historical figures may still linger, perpetually seeking the mention of their name. They are the whispers of ancient fears embodied, the unseen victims of a terror that transcended the physical, leaving behind a profound mental scar. The symbolism of the labyrinth in the mind. The recurring historical motif of the labyrinth, from the Greek Minotaur myth to the intricate floor patterns of medieval cathedrals, symbolize the confusing, perilous inner world of the human mind. The labyrinth was not merely a physical puzzle, but a metaphor for the mind's tendency towards self-delusion and its vulnerability to internal traps. The deeper one travelled, the closer one came to the Minotaur, a primal, irrational consciousness, representing the hidden horrors that could only be defeated by the thread of reason. Medieval theologians later adapted this concept, viewing the mind as a moral labyrinth where one could easily get lost in sin, doubt, and heresy. This spiritualization of the metaphor created a powerful psychological fear that losing the thread of faith meant not just spiritual death, but complete mental disintegration into a primal, bestial state. The goal of the pilgrim was not to find a treasure, but to prevent the awakening of the inherent monster within, proving that the mind's primary historical purpose was considered self-control against its own potential for terror. This symbolic imagery confirms the continuous narrative suspicion. The mind is compromised, a haunted castle where the interplay of light and darkness is a perpetual war. The terror comes from the idea that the Minotaur is not confined to the centre. It can be glimpsed in the reflective surfaces of our own thoughts. The terrifying architectural consistency of the labyrinth across cultures suggests a shared ancient knowledge of the mind's flaw, a flaw that allows external supernatural influences to help lead us deeper into the darkness. The historical fear of mirror scrying. Ancient practitioners of mirror scrying or catoptromancy believed the mirror was not merely a reflection, but a psychic gateway, a deliberate open loop to a non-physical reality. The historical terror associated with this practice was the belief that the reflection itself held a separate, possibly malevolent consciousness, a shadow self that could be traded for the original. Glimpsing the reflection of a cursed object or an eerie symbol in the mirror was said to permanently imprint that malevolence onto the scryer's soul, causing an agonizing breakdown of identity. The mirror's potential for psychological horror was institutionalized in certain ancient rituals where the sick or afflicted were shown their own reflection after being told they were possessed. The subsequent terror and dissociation were seen as the spirit attempting to leave the body, proving the mind's deep, almost superstitious connection to symbolic imagery. This manipulation demonstrates the mind's profound suggestibility, turning a simple object into a weapon of self-terror, confirming the mind's inability to distinguish manufactured reality from actual spiritual threat. The enduring cultural fear of broken mirrors, bringing 7 years of bad luck, is a historical remnant of this terror. A fractured mirror meant a fractured self, an irreparable breach in the psychic protection. The mirror is a perfect metaphor for the mind itself, a powerful tool for self-reflection that, when tampered with, invites supernatural influences to manipulate our identity. It confirms that the mind's integrity is a fragile thing, easily shattered, leaving the self vulnerable to permanent ancient corruption. The terrifying case of Pavor Nocturnus, the medieval condition of Pavor Nocturnus, night terrors, was not attributed to mere dreams, but to a malicious, nocturnal demon known as the incubus or succubus, who physically weighed down the sleeper, causing sleep paralysis and the sensation of being choked. This historical interpretation solidified the belief that the terrifying visions of the night were not internal malfunctions, but proof of a nightly supernatural influence, a physical attack on the most vulnerable unconscious mind. The shared imagery of the demon sitting on the chest suggests a terrifying consistency in these psychological assaults. The common experience during these terrors, a profound inability to move, speak, or scream, was seen as the mind being temporarily locked out of its own physical vessel, leaving the soul in a state of conscious, helpless panic. The chilling aspect is that the human mind fabricated a hyper-realistic shared mythological narrative to explain a purely neurological event, preferring the terror of possession over the uncertainty of an internal malfunction. This cultural acceptance of a demonic explanation provided a perverse, terrifying answer to the question of hidden horrors. The cultural response to this phenomenon involved protective talismans and bedside rituals, all aimed at shielding the mind from the night's psychic invasion. The fact that the incubus myth is nearly universal proves that the sleeping mind is a standardized target. It is the place where the thin boundary between myth and reality dissolves completely, allowing ancient, forgotten forces to leave a terrifying psychological scar, using the cover of darkness to perpetrate a feeling of eternal, helpless dread. The psychological weapon of ancient war drums. In ancient and early medieval warfare, certain cultures employed large, specially tuned war drums designed not just for rhythm, but to generate extremely low-frequency infrasound. This nearly inaudible, pervasive sound was historically recorded as causing intense disorientation, involuntary panic, and deep emotional distress. A direct physical manipulation of the mind by vibration. This was one of the earliest known historical uses of sound as a psychological weapon, inducing a collective manufactured whispers of ancient fears on the battlefield. The purpose of these low-frequency assaults was to create an atmosphere of profound dread that bypassed the soldier's conscious perception, targeting the mind's primal emotional centers. Victims reported feeling an irrational cold terror, as if a non-physical entity were standing directly behind them, even in broad daylight. This historical fact confirms that the mind's vulnerability is not just spiritual or psychological, but can be physically exploited, proving the body is merely a resonator for terror that can be tuned by external forces. This technique reveals a terrifying ancient truth, that the mind's emotional state can be externally dictated, turning trained soldiers into panicked mobs through simple physics. If a drum could induce a collective terror, what pervasive low-frequency energies are currently being projected onto the collective mind, influencing our decision-making and triggering the ancient codes of inherited violence? The battlefield was merely the proving ground for a quieter, more pervasive form of psychological warfare that continues to leave the open loop vulnerable. The doctrine of the imago spiritus. In certain early Christian Gnostic texts, suppressed and labelled heretical, there was a doctrine concerning the imago spiritus, or the spirit image. This referred to the belief that every person's mind secretly held the potential for two distinct souls, one divine and one demonic duplicate. The demonic duplicate, or shadow self, was said to be an almost exact copy that only emerged when the person committed a truly horrific, world-altering atrocity, leaving the original soul intact but irrevocably stained. The terrifying consequence of the imago spiritus was the belief that the original soul remained accountable for the shadow self's actions. This historical doctrine created an immense psychological burden, forcing individuals to constantly monitor their thoughts and prevent the dissolution of the personal self into its dark reflection. It introduced a profound unresolvable paranoia, the constant fear that your most hateful thoughts were actually the stirrings of an internal, autonomous, non-physical entity waiting for its moment to be born. This ancient forbidden knowledge offers a chilling perspective on our series' central question. Perhaps the worst horrors of history were not committed by inherently evil individuals, but by ordinary people who simply allowed the pre-existing demonic duplicate in their mind to awaken. This permanent internal duality means that the hidden horrors are not external mysteries, but are permanently coded into our essential nature, a horrifying piece of inherited violence that is simply waiting for a stressful moment to be activated. The historical mania of the tarantella beginning in the 15th century, southern Italy experienced widespread outbreaks of a mania known as the tarantella, where victims, mostly young women, were overcome by an uncontrollable urge to dance wildly for days, often until collapse or death. Historians trace the cause to a single belief: the bite of a venomous spider, the tarantula, whose poison could only be cured by frantic continuous movement. This was a classic case of mass hysteria, where a psychological fear was given a physical curative ritual. The frightening reality was that very few victims had actually been bitten by a spider. The dance was the mind's response to extreme social or psychological stress, manifesting as a bizarre, physically demanding contagion. This proves the human mind is capable of creating a collective, physical illness out of pure social pressure, a terrifying testament to its suggestibility. The frantic movement and music served as a social open loop, allowing the hysterical symptoms to spread contagiously across the entire community, transcending any biological barrier. The tarantella is a dark historical lesson in the boundary between myth and reality, demonstrating that if a collective belief is strong enough, it can bypass physical law. The spider was not the cause. The belief in the spider was the cause. This confirms that the mind's ability to invent and share a horrifying narrative is the most dangerous form of power, creating a self-sustaining symbolic imagery that continues to feed the collective trauma. The underlying terror is that we are all constantly susceptible to these sudden, chaotic psychological invasions. the ancient terror of nonlinear time. Ancient philosophers like Heraclitus or concepts of Satya Yuga in Hindu tradition presented a terrifying nonlinear view of time, where historical events do not pass, but merely cycle and repeat eternally. This nonlinear perspective created a unique form of psychological dread, the certainty that the worst atrocities, the massacres, the plagues, the betrayals, were not only in the past, but were waiting to happen again in precisely the same manner. This forced the mind to exist in a perpetual state of fear, where the hidden horrors were both memory and prophecy. This historical understanding of cyclic time removed the comfort of progress, suggesting that human consciousness is trapped in a kind of cosmic prison, forced to witness the same patterns of inherited violence indefinitely. It means the evil we see is not defeated, merely resting. The mind's greatest historical struggle was coping with the knowledge that its efforts were meaningless, as the terror would always return. This nonlinear dread is a profound form of mental torture, a relentless psychological weapon against the idea of redemption or escape. This ancient theory aligns chillingly with the idea of a corrupting force, the supernatural influences that perpetuate historical trauma. If time is an open loop, then the spiritual forces that fed on the suffering of the past are simply waiting for the cycle to bring the suffering back to them. The mind, being the locus of historical memory, is the key to unlocking this cycle. We may be forced to replay history's horrors not because we are destined to, but because an ancient entity is orchestrating the eternal return of human suffering through the flawed mechanism of our memory. The medieval doctrine of mental contagion. During periods of intense political or religious unrest, medieval authorities promoted the doctrine of mental contagion, the belief that a single heretical or blasphemous thought could literally infect the minds of a village simply through proximity. This was a form of psychological germ theory, where an evil thought was treated as a dangerous spiritual pathogen, demonstrating the profound historical fear of thought pollution and the mind's porosity. The perceived danger was so immense that physical isolation was often prescribed for those deemed to have been mentally infected. The paranoia induced by this doctrine was immense, forcing individuals to not only police their own thoughts, but also to suspect the hidden thoughts of their neighbours. The mind became the battlefield, and the community was forced into a state of continuous psychological surveillance to prevent the spread of these hidden horrors. The fear was not of the external enemy, but of the insidious, unseen enemy that could travel on a whisper or a glance, turning neighbour against neighbour in a frantic effort to prevent the awakening of collective evil. The doctrine of mental contagion perfectly explains why mass hysteria was so prevalent in this era. The belief that one's mind could be infected by the thoughts of another created the very vulnerability it sought to prevent. This historical fear confirms the continuous narrative. The collective mind is fragile, an interconnected web that is easily hijacked by whispers of ancient fears which need only one point of entry. The mind, therefore, is not a safe, solitary place, but a vulnerable, shared medium for spiritual viruses. The ancient use of sensory deprivation for prophecy. Various ancient mystical traditions, from Egyptian priests to Siberian shamans, routinely subjected initiates to extreme sensory deprivation, often involving complete darkness, silence, and isolation in ancient crypts, not to calm the mind, but to intentionally induce psychological and neurological breakdown. The goal was to reach a state of hypersuggestibility, where the mind, starved of input, would begin to spontaneously generate visions, voices, and information, which were then interpreted as sacred knowledge or forgotten truths from the gods. The terrifying knowledge held by these historical practitioners was that the mind, when pushed past its limits, will create its own reality to fill the void. The voices and visions they heard were often terrifying, violent, or filled with images of inherited violence, suggesting that the deepest well of the unconscious is filled with the collective trauma of the species. The rituals were, therefore, a deliberate physical act of psychological self-harm, an attempt to bypass reason and access the primal, dark truth encoded into the human psyche. The fact that the mind's ultimate breakdown was considered the only path to true knowledge confirms the mind is fundamentally compromised, its true contents horrifying. The practice was a conscious attempt to open the open loop and invite whatever non-physical entity was waiting on the other side. This historical desperation to know the truth, even at the cost of sanity, shows that the human mind has always been suspected of holding a secret that is both cosmic and terrifying, a final, destructive piece of forbidden knowledge. The psychological symbolism of the cursed object. Throughout history, the cursed object, from the infamous Hope Diamond to the legend of Tutankhamun's tomb, has always served as a potent psychological device. The terror lies not in the object's physical reality, but in the collective human belief that a physical item can hold and transmit pure malice, effectively turning the object into a psychological virus. The object provides a convenient external container for the mind's internal fears, a terrifying symbol of the mind's inability to accept that evil is self-generated. The historical accounts of those afflicted by such objects almost always describe a rapid descent into paranoia, madness, and obsession, symptoms that are psychologically contagious. The object becomes a focus point for the interplay of light and darkness, a physical totem that concentrates the whispers of ancient fears and projects them outward onto susceptible minds. The victim's mind is thus hijacked by the perceived power of the artifact, dissolving the personal will into the artifact's presumed malevolent intention, leading to a profound sense of external control. The cursed object is the perfect metaphor for the continuous narrative, a physical anchor for a supernatural influence, proving that the mind's fragility can be exploited by matter. If an inanimate object can be imbued with enough collective terror to dictate human behavior, then the mind is merely a receiver, easily tuned to broadcast terror. The object simply provides the mental permission for the victim to enact their own hidden horrors, demonstrating the mind's capacity for self-deception and its eternal search for an external scapegoat for its internal darkness. The psychological terror of the watchful eye, the pervasive historical motif of the shadowed eye or the evil eye, known as the mal de ojo, was a terrifying acknowledgement that simply being perceived could cause illness, misfortune, and death. The mind's vulnerability here is absolute, resting on the belief that a neighbour's malice, or an eerie symbol placed in a doorway, could transmit pure, focused psychological harm. The victim's paranoia was the true weapon, leading to the dissolution of the personal self as they lost trust in all social interactions. This cultural fear created elaborate systems of protective rituals and counter-charms, all aimed at physically or symbolically diverting the malicious gaze. These historical practices were a massive, collective psychological defense mechanism, demonstrating the mind's profound need to externalize its own vulnerability. The constant fear of being watched, of having one's thoughts and actions judged by an unseen malicious eye, forced the populace into a state of perpetual psychological self-policing, ensuring conformity and preventing the social open loop of chaos. The terror of the evil eye is a chilling truth for our narrative. It proves that the mind is a battlefield where perception itself is weaponized. The true evil eye is not external. It is the mind's own reflection, projecting its deepest insecurities and fears onto the world. This collective belief in the malicious gaze confirms the mind's fragility, showing how easily it can be manipulated by a simple glance or a potent symbolic imagery, turning the act of seeing into an act of self-betrayal and perpetual, unfounded dread. The historical fear of self-imposed stigmata, medieval records, detail cases of individuals, particularly highly devout women, whose intense spiritual fervour and prolonged periods of self-denial led to the spontaneous manifestation of the stigmata, the physical wounds of Christ. This was interpreted as a divine sign, yet it is a terrifying historical example of the mind's ultimate power, its ability to completely override biological reality and physically wound the body based on psychological and spiritual desire. The mind created the wounds, blurring the boundary between myth and reality. This phenomenon reveals a hidden historical knowledge, the deep psychological link between extreme piety and extreme physical pain. The mind, through intense focus and collective religious expectation, became a surgical tool carving symbolic imagery into the flesh. This ability to weaponize belief against one's own body confirms a terrifying level of self-mastery that is, in itself, a form of self-torture. It is the ultimate expression of the mind's power to create a physical illness out of a purely mental or spiritual state. The self-imposed stigmata is a terrifying truth for our narrative because it shows that the mind can manifest anything it believes in with sufficient intensity, including hidden horrors. If the mind can conjure the wounds of God, what ancient destructive commands could it be enacting under the influence of the shadowy forces we are investigating? It suggests that the open loop in the mind is a two-way street, capable of pulling the supernatural into the physical world, making the body an unwilling sacrifice to a terrifying idea, the philosophical dread of the simulation. Ancient philosophical concepts such as Plato's cave and Vedic ideas of Maya, illusion, reveal an ancient, pervasive dread that our entire perceived reality is merely a complex mental construction, a simulation. This historical dread implies that the mind is trapped in a non-physical plane, with all sensory data being fed to it by an unknown, possibly malevolent outside force. This fear of being perpetually fooled is a profound form of psychological paranoia that has plagued human consciousness for millennia. This ancient anxiety suggests that the worst hidden horrors are not the acts we commit, but the fundamental lie we live within. If reality is merely a projection, then any external supernatural influence could simply be the programmer altering the code, making the mind's perception of reality its greatest vulnerability. The search for forgotten truths becomes a terrifying quest to find the flaw in the simulation's code, a flaw that could lead to the complete dissolution of the personal self once the lie is revealed. The concept of Maya is a chilling reflection of the mind's deep-seated historical suspicion of its own senses. If the mind believes it is in a simulation, the capacity for inherited violence increases as the value of actions becomes meaningless in a non-real world. The enduring power of the simulation theory confirms that the human mind has always suspected it is not truly free, but is merely a fragile processor of a grand, terrifying illusion, perpetuated by ancient, unknown forces that mock its every act of reason. The historical practice of fear testing. In certain ancient warrior cultures and early medieval orders, candidates for high office or spiritual leadership were subjected to fear testing, a deliberate ritualistic exposure to extreme, often life-threatening psychological and physical horrors. The goal was to find the candidate whose mind could remain perfectly calm when facing the primal terror of death, thereby identifying an individual with a profound, almost inhuman, level of mental detachment and control. The test was designed to see if the mind could prevent the awakening of its own survival instinct. This historical practice reveals a terrifying conclusion, that the ultimate human leader was not the bravest, but the one whose mind was most capable of dissociation and emotional coldness. The ability to remain detached when faced with whispers of ancient fears was seen as proof of a superior, almost alien, consciousness. This historical preference for a cold, controlled mind confirms the series' theme that true power often aligns with psychological malfunction or a deliberate suppression of human empathy and vulnerability. The fear-testing ritual creates a chilling, open loop in the historical narrative. It selects for minds that are potentially most receptive to the shadowy force we are tracking, as only a mind already partially compromised can maintain perfect control under such duress. The warrior who passed the test was not immune to the darkness, he was simply already in league with it, capable of suppressing his own humanity to achieve ultimate control. This suggests that history's greatest, most terrifying leaders may have been deliberately engineered for cold, systematic, inherited violence. The ancient power of rhythmic chant. Across countless historical cultures, from Buddhist monks to tribal shamans, the practice of rhythmic, repetitive chanting or singing was used to induce trance states, hallucinations, and altered consciousness. This practice was a direct neurological manipulation of the mind by sound, a conscious effort to overwhelm the seat of reason with a relentless pattern. The chant served as a collective sonic open loop, intentionally pushing the mind into a state where it was receptive to forgotten truths and susceptible to mass psychological influence. The historical accounts of these induced trances often describe participants experiencing collective visions, feelings of non-personal identity, and a shared connection to the spirits or gods. This proves that the mind's autonomy is easily dissolved by sustained, repetitive sensory input, leading to a temporary collective dissolution of the personal self. The chant, therefore, was not merely music, it was a tool for spiritual warfare, capable of erasing the individual to create a powerful but terrifyingly suggestible collective mind. The power of rhythmic chant demonstrates a terrifying truth about the mind's historical vulnerability, that the darkness does not need a complex spell, it only needs repetition. The subtle, pervasive chants used in historical cults and esoteric orders suggest a simple, effective method for supernatural influences to gain widespread control. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its emotional intensity, making all intense feeling, whether good or bad, a potential trigger for ancient, self-destructive programming. The psychological toll of the medieval memento mori. The medieval practice of memento mori, the deliberate, constant reminder of one's inevitable death, was a psychological tool meant to purify the soul, but it also induced a profound, paralyzing historical dread. The constant presence of death symbolic imagery, skulls, decaying figures, dark sermons, forced the mind into a state of perpetual morbid obsession, where every fleeting thought was judged against the absolute finality of the grave. The mind was intentionally tortured by the certainty of its own non-existence. This historical obsession was so profound that it often caused melancholia mortis, melancholy of death, a crippling depression that led to social withdrawal and, paradoxically, an inability to live. The medieval mind was intentionally trained to value death over life, creating a psychological vulnerability that allowed the interplay of light and darkness to be perpetually skewed toward the darkness. This deliberate focus on decay was a cultural open loop, inviting despair and a crippling psychological burden that crushed the will to resist historical horrors. The memento mori is the psychological key to understanding why past societies seemed so readily willing to accept and even embrace mass death and self-flagellation. It confirms that the mind can be successfully reprogrammed by pervasive culture to welcome its own destruction. If the mind can be conditioned to desire non-existence, then the influence of the shadow force is simply finding fertile ground in a consciousness already resigned to its own terror. The hidden horrors are the ones the mind is already trained to accept without question. The historical trauma of uncanny doubles. Ancient and medieval folklore from around the world is saturated with tales of the doppelganger, or fetch, an unnervingly accurate double of a living person, a non-physical entity whose appearance foretold death or madness. The psychological terror of the double is that it is a perfect imitation of the self that lacks a soul, proving the boundary between myth and reality is easily breached by a simple image. The mind's integrity is instantly compromised by the sight of its own duplication. Historical accounts of seeing one's own double often precede sudden psychological breakdowns, suggesting that the mind is fundamentally incapable of resolving the paradox of the doppelganger. The double serves as a physical representation of the mind's latent duality, the demonic duplicate that is waiting for its moment to emerge. The mind is terrified because it recognizes the double as its own shadowed eye, a perfect reflection of its potential for self-betrayal and cold, systematic inherited violence that it can no longer suppress. The double confirms the continuous narrative's suspicion. The greatest threat to the self is the self. The doppelganger is a weaponized hallucination, a piece of symbolic imagery that proves the mind can project its own death sentence. The shadowy force we track doesn't need to invent a new monster. It merely needs to project the ultimate horror, the soulless copy, to shatter the victim's sanity. The mind is its own executioner, capable of manufacturing a trauma so profound it negates the very concept of the individual. The psychological isolation of the anchorite. The historical practice of anchoritism, where devout individuals voluntarily sealed themselves inside small, cramped cells attached to church walls for their entire lives, was a radical experiment in psychological isolation. This self-imposed imprisonment was intended to cleanse the soul, but it often led to profound hallucinations, auditory phenomena, and the terrifying dissolution of the personal self. The mind, deprived of new sensory input, turned inward, manufacturing its own reality from whispers of ancient fears. The historical records of these anchorites detail a mind that, once isolated, became a terrifying battlefield of internal voices and monstrous visions. This proves the mind requires external verification to maintain its sanity. By eliminating the outside world, the anchorite unintentionally created an ideal open loop for supernatural influences to enter the mind's now empty landscape. The cell was meant to keep the evil out, but it only served to trap the individual inside a space where the distinction between thought and spiritual attack vanished. The isolation of the anchorite provides a chilling metaphor for the fundamental terror of consciousness. The moment you're truly alone with your thoughts, you are most vulnerable. The mind will, out of necessity, invent its own company, and that company is almost always terrifying, drawing from the deepest, most primal well of the unconscious. This self-inflicted psychological wound confirms that the mind's fragility is inherent and that absolute isolation is simply the fastest path toward a collective, ancient and terrifying insanity. The ancient concept of the memory palace. The classical technique of the memory palace, method of Lotzi, was an ancient mnemonic device that involved mentally mapping information onto a familiar physical space. However, esoteric historical interpretations held that this mental palace could become spiritually active, a non-physical plane that could be invaded by foreign entities. The fear was that the palace could become corrupted, turning treasured memories into hidden horrors, or using the mental architecture to deliver hidden commands, turning the mind into a programmable weapon. The terrifying implication of the corrupted memory palace was the belief that the architecture of one's thoughts could be literally rewired by an external force. If a supernatural influence could substitute a false, malevolent memory for a true one, the person's identity would be completely subverted without their knowledge. This concept demonstrates a profound historical suspicion of the mind's foundational structure, viewing it not as a natural fortress, but as a complex, vulnerable building designed by a flawed architect, the human ego itself. The memory palace provides a terrifying psychological model for the continuous narrative's shadowy force. Our antagonist does not need to destroy the mind, it only needs to hijack the architecture. By simply changing the location of a key historical fact, it can alter the subsequent actions of the person. This proves that the mind's integrity is directly tied to its physical structure. The mind is merely a complex set of empty rooms waiting for a malicious entity to move its cursed object into the central hall, thereby taking complete control. The psychological dread of the unheimlich Sigmund Freud later defined the unheimlich, uncanny, as the psychological terror we feel when something familiar is made suddenly and horrifyingly alien, a feeling rooted in something repressed that has returned. But ancient and medieval thought understood this dread as the presence of a forgotten truth, a flash of pure primal memory from the collective unconscious that confirmed the world was not as it seemed. The uncanny was the temporary dissolution of the boundary between myth and reality. The uncanny was the mind's sudden, terrifying recognition of its own deep historical trauma, a moment when the self recognized its own inherited violence or saw a sign that defied all reason. This historical understanding reveals that the mind's deepest fear is not the unknown, but the known that has been forcibly suppressed, the memory of an ancient, terrifying event that the species has collectively agreed to forget. The uncanny moment is the moment when the mind attempts to prevent the awakening of the truth but fails, leading to temporary madness. This sense of pervasive, unsettling familiarity, the uncanny, is the foundation of our entire narrative. The creepiest facts are terrifying because they feel right in a horrifying way, suggesting a deep internal recognition of the shadow force. This proves that the mind's memory is a vast, open archive of trauma that can be accessed at any time by a simple, eerie symbol or misplaced thought. The ultimate horror is that the mind is a history book that constantly tries to destroy its own most important, terrifying pages. The ancient fear of thought, capture. Ancient philosophical and alchemical texts occasionally reference the mythical concept of thought capture, the belief that certain esoteric rituals or devices could physically extract and contain a person's thoughts, emotions, and even consciousness. The terrifying implication was that your mind was not a private space, but a source of power that could be stolen. This concept demonstrates a profound, historical dread of the dissolution of the personal self, where one's existence could continue as a purely mental captive of a foreign entity. The historical fear of thought capture led to protective measures that were both physical and psychological, primarily involving the constant recitation of protective phrases or the wearing of elaborate amulets. These countermeasures reveal an understanding that the mind needed constant noise or distraction to prevent the malicious entity from finding a quiet moment to perform the theft. This intentional overstimulation suggests an ancient knowledge. The mind's greatest vulnerability is its moments of complete silence and reflection. The idea of thought capture perfectly encapsulates the continuous narrative's antagonist, a force that profits not from physical harm, but from mental slavery. If the shadowy force can steal consciousness, then history's greatest minds may not have died. They may have simply become eternal mental prisoners, their thoughts now being used as weapons against us. This confirms that the mind's terrifying flaw is that it is a powerful, easily exploited resource, a constantly broadcasting open loop that can be tuned and seized by the supernatural influences. The historical weaponization of shame. In many early societies, public shaming and ritualistic humiliation were used not just as punishment, but as a deliberate psychological tool to completely destroy the individual's sense of self-worth and belonging. This was a form of psychological violence designed to break the mind's integrity, forcing the individual into a state of profound psychological vulnerability. The victim's mind was intentionally open to mass hysteria and extreme suggestibility, making them a compliant, easily controlled vessel for the community's directives. This historical method of control demonstrates a dark, ancient knowledge that the mind's greatest strength is its connection to the group, and that by severing that connection through humiliation, the individual mind can be completely dismantled. The terror of social exclusion was so immense that it often led to voluntary exile or even suicide, proving that the mind's need for belonging overrides its will to live. The shame, therefore, was a psychological acid that caused a rapid and terrifying dissolution of the personal self. The weaponization of shame confirms the continuous narrative's dark theme. The mind is compromised by its own social needs. The shadowy force does not need to use physical violence. It simply needs to trigger the human fear of isolation to gain control. The constant ambient shame that permeates much of historical and modern society is a lingering symptom of this ancient psychological weapon, a pervasive open loop that continues to enforce conformity and prevent the awakening of independent thought. The ancient mystery of the locus, Dolores. Ancient Chinese and later Renaissance medical texts referenced a concept known as the locus doloris, the place of pain, a mythical, non-physical organ in the body that was believed to be the true, eternal seat of all suffering, separate from the brain or nervous system. This historical belief suggested that pain was not a simple signal, but a separate, parasitic, non-physical entity that could be transferred from person to person or attached to a cursed object. This acknowledged a profound disconnect between physical suffering and mental perception. This historical idea meant that the cure for chronic pain was not physical. It was an exorcism, a ritualistic attempt to remove the parasitic entity residing in the locus doloris. This demonstrates a terrifying ancient truth. The mind had to cope with the possibility that its suffering was eternal and autonomous, a hidden horror that could never be truly destroyed, only temporarily relocated. This belief forced the mind to externalize its deepest pain, making it vulnerable to the influence of malevolent non-physical forces. The locus doloris is the perfect transition point for our narrative, linking the mind's internal terror to the external world. If pain is an autonomous entity, then suffering itself is the product of the shadow force, a currency that is intentionally farmed. The mind's vulnerability is that it is the primary host for this parasitic entity. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the sound of the locus doloris vibrating, proving that the deepest human pain is not a failure of the body, but a weapon wielded by ancient unknown forces. The Roman terror of larvae vagante. The ancient Roman concept of larvae vagantes referred to the restless spirits of those who died violently or without proper rites. Not ghosts, but wandering, corrupted mental projections that could attach themselves to the living. These entities were believed to enter the mind during sleep, inducing nightmares, anxiety, and a form of mental exhaustion that led to the permanent interplay of light and darkness. They were a form of psychological residue, a historical pollutant left behind by unresolved human trauma. The Roman cure for the larvae vagant involved elaborate midnight rituals where the head of the household would throw black beans over their shoulder, asking the spectres to leave. This psychological ritual was not about appeasing the dead, but about actively rejecting the dark, intrusive thoughts, proving that the mind needed a physical act to dispel psychological fear. This historical practice acknowledges that the subconscious is an open loop to the collective mental debris of the past. The idea of a historical residue of corrupted mental projections is a terrifying answer to our central question. The shadow force does not need to constantly attack us. It merely needs to harvest the psychic waste left by history's victims. The larvae vagantes are the whispers of ancient fears embodied, the persistent psychological echo of inherited violence that continues to infect our consciousness. This confirms that the suffering of the past is never truly gone. It is simply waiting in the atmosphere to be reabsorbed by a susceptible mind. The psychological toll of the medieval psychomachia. The concept of the psychomachia, soul war, was a dominant psychological theme in the Middle Ages, depicting the mind as a perpetual battleground where allegorical virtues and vices, like hope, despair, lust, faith, fought for control of the soul. This historical framing forced the mind into a constant state of agonizing internal conflict, viewing every thought as a potential military maneuver by a non-physical entity. This profound psychological dualism ensured that the mind could never find peace, always perceiving itself as under siege. This relentless internal war was deliberately cultivated by religious orders to enforce self-monitoring, creating a constant, exhausting form of mental surveillance that prevented the dissolution of the personal self. The terrifying consequence was that any moment of weakness or moral doubt was instantly perceived as the vices gaining ground, leading to overwhelming psychological guilt and the belief in imminent spiritual defeat. The mind's own structure was weaponized against its own happiness, making internal peace impossible. The psychomachia is the perfect example of the mind being intentionally compromised by a powerful external narrative. The shadowy force does not need to invent new evils. It simply needs to enforce a mental structure that ensures perpetual internal conflict. The hidden horrors are the thoughts themselves, now labelled as vices, forcing the mind to attack its own impulses. The mind is perpetually trapped in a civil war, a terrifying open loop of self-recrimination that prevents the emergence of any unifying autonomous self. The historical fear of the genius loci. Ancient Roman religion held a deep, fearful respect for the genius loci, the spirit of the place, a non-physical entity believed to embody the unique character, fortune, and mood of a specific location. The terrifying aspect was the belief that these spirits could actively change the psychological state of people who settled there, inducing profound melancholy, irrational aggression, or a collective sense of profound dread. This acknowledged a historical reality. The environment dictated the mind's integrity. The most feared genius loci were those attached to ancient forgotten battlefields or places of former ritual sacrifice. The haunted locations that were considered magnetically charged with inherited violence. Settlers in these areas would often experience uncharacteristic mood swings or violent impulses which were blamed on the parasitic influence of the site's spirit. This proves that the mind's emotional stability was historically believed to be an external, geographical vulnerability, not a personal one. The genius loci provides a physical anchor for our series Shadow Force. The recurring historical horrors we investigate may be connected not by time or ideology, but by geography, the places where the ancient influence remains strongest, poisoning the minds of those who settle there. The land itself is a cursed object, a transmitter of psychological distress that turns the mind into a vessel for ancient trauma. This confirms that the mind is fundamentally porous, a passive receiver easily tuned to broadcast the darkness of the earth beneath it. The psychological paradox of martyrdom. The historical glorification of martyrdom, the embrace of extreme physical suffering for a belief, created a chilling psychological paradox. the mind found its greatest strength and meaning in its own physical destruction. This cultural phenomenon enforced the idea that the body was merely a disposable vessel, its suffering a necessary tool to prove the mind's superiority. This historical emphasis on pain as a virtue was a profound, psychologically damaging rejection of the self's biological imperative to survive. This psychological programming led to a terrifying cultural climate where pain was sought out and celebrated, creating a pervasive open loop for masochistic rituals and self-harm. The martyr's mind was one that had achieved complete dissolution of the personal self, having traded its individual identity for an absolute, non-negotiable belief system. This transcendence of physical pain demonstrated the mind's ultimate, terrifying capacity to manipulate its own sensory reality, proving that belief can literally nullify the body's warning signals. The martyr's mind is a warning to our continuous narrative. The shadowy force does not need to threaten us. It only needs to convince us that pain is sacred. If the mind can be convinced that suffering is a virtue, the historical repetition of atrocities becomes inevitable, as the mind willingly sacrifices the body for a terrible idea. This psychological paradox is the ultimate hidden horror, confirming the mind's vulnerability to extreme, all-consuming ideological takeover, making it the most dangerous weapon ever conceived. The ancient doctrine of thought atoms. Certain obscure pre-Socratic and alchemical texts hinted at the concept of thought atoms, the belief that consciousness was not continuous but composed of discrete, physical particles that could be rearranged, tainted, or even stolen. This terrifying belief suggested that a malicious force could chemically alter the mind, replacing benevolent thoughts with inherited violence or forgotten truths using purely material means. This was the earliest form of psychological materialism, viewing the mind as a purely mechanical, vulnerable structure. The concept of thought atoms created a constant, pervasive dread that one's morality or sanity could be irrevocably corrupted by accidental contact with a tainted substance or a spiritual pollutant. This historical anxiety led to elaborate rituals of mental and physical cleansing, all aimed at purging the body of these malicious particles. This psychological defense mechanism proves that the mind historically believed its integrity was dependent on a constant, almost chemical purity, highlighting its terrifying fragility. The doctrine of thought atoms is a chilling answer for our narrative. The shadowy force we seek may not be spiritual, but a form of ancient psychological pollution, a historical residue that chemically alters the human mind. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the sound of these corrupted thought atoms vibrating inside the skull, forcing the mind to act against its own nature. This confirms that the mind's deepest flaw is its physical nature, proving it is a vulnerable machine, easily broken and reprogrammed for terror. The medieval terror of the empty, House's medieval demonology spoke of the mind of the newly converted or recently absolved sinner as an empty house, a frighteningly vacant space where the old evil had been swept out, but nothing had yet been put back in. The terror was that this psychological void was uniquely susceptible to an immediate, powerful reinvasion by the original demon, who would now bring 7 other spirits worse than itself. This was a profound historical warning about the danger of mental vacuum, demonstrating that the absence of a fixed guiding moral compass is far more dangerous than the presence of a known evil, as the mind becomes a passive structure. This doctrine created an extreme psychological pressure for the penitent to constantly fill their minds with prayer, good works, or religious study, fearing that any moment of mental idleness would create the open loop necessary for demonic reinvasion. This shows a terrifying historical understanding. The mind, like nature, abhors a vacuum, and if the self does not actively populate the space, a non-physical entity is always waiting to move in and exploit the absence of a strong, fixed self. The collective consciousness recognized that an undefended mind was a vector for spiritual plague. The empty house is a powerful metaphor for the continuous narrative. The mind's integrity is not maintained by purity, but by constant use and vigilance. The pervasive cultural fear of idleness or contemplation is a remnant of this ancient terror, a collective psychological defense against the invasion of the 7 worst spirits. The shadowy force we track does not need to fight to gain entry. It simply waits for the moment of mental exhaustion or withdrawal, proving the mind is a territory that must be actively guarded or it will be lost forever. The historical madness of the lycanthrope. The historical belief in lycanthropy, the voluntary or involuntary transformation into a wolf or wolf-like creature, was a terrifying psychological phenomenon documented across medieval Europe. It was often a form of psychological dissociation, where the afflicted mind completely rejected its own humanity, preferring the primal simplicity of the beast. This was a radical, self-imposed dissolution of the personal self, proving the mind can manufacture a complete bestial identity, fueled by the collective myth of the monstrous human. The fear surrounding lycanthropes was intense because it confirmed a chilling suspicion that the inherited violence of the predatory animal was deeply coded into the human psyche, needing only a trigger, be it a curse, a ritual, or profound madness to be unleashed. The supposed ability to shift form was merely the externalization of an internal chaos, demonstrating the mind's ability to turn its deepest hidden horrors into a physical social threat. The historical search for the lycanthrope was a search for the monster within all men. The enduring myth of the werewolf provides a clear vector for the supernatural influences that perpetuate historical trauma. If the mind can be convinced it is a beast, it can commit acts of unspeakable savagery, believing itself absolved by its animal nature. The lycanthrope is the ultimate psychological weapon, where the dark force simply guides the mind to embrace its most primal, destructive desires, exploiting the thin boundary between myth and reality to unleash systematic predatory violence upon the world. The ancient belief in mind parasites. Ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts mention spiritual entities often described as mind parasites or soul weevils, non-physical entities that did not possess the body, but rather fed exclusively on the victim's creativity, memory, and sense of joy. The victim would feel a profound, inexplicable mental exhaustion and a slow, agonizing dissolution of the personal self, becoming a hollow echo of their former brilliance. This concept reveals a historical fear of mental exploitation and intellectual impotence. The priests and healers attempting to cure this affliction focused on rituals intended to starve out the parasite, by encouraging intense creative or intellectual bursts, believing the mental energy would temporarily overwhelm the invading entity. This defense mechanism demonstrates a historical understanding. The mind must be aggressively active to maintain its integrity, or it risks becoming a passive field for psychic harvesting. The subtle, pervasive nature of the attack made it one of the most feared hidden horrors. The idea of a mind parasite is a terrifying answer to the consistency of historical stagnation and psychological oppression. Perhaps the shadow force is not actively malicious, but simply a harvesting entity that maintains the historical open loop by subtly draining the world's most innovative minds, ensuring that humanity never achieves the full potential required to resist ancient influence. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the silent chewing of the parasite on the soul's essence, a subtle, eternal form of psychic warfare. The psychological trauma of the scapegoat. The ancient practice of the scapegoat, where a person, animal, or object was ritualistically loaded with the community's collective sins, reveals a profound, terrifying psychological mechanism. The mind, unable to cope with collective guilt and the fear of inherited violence, creates a single, external repository for its own moral failures. The intentional psychological destruction of the scapegoat was a mass act of self-delusion, where the community convinced itself that its darkness was entirely externalized and purged. This ritual proves that the human mind, particularly the collective mind, prioritizes psychological comfort over moral truth. By projecting its hidden horrors onto an innocent victim, the collective mind ensures the continuation of its own internal darkness, believing it has achieved temporary spiritual cleanliness. This mass psychological displacement created a dangerous precedent, the belief that responsibility for atrocities could always be transferred, ensuring the historical open loop of violence and moral avoidance. The scapegoat is the psychological cornerstone of the continuous narrative's dark force. The shadow force does not need to possess entire populations, it simply needs to provide a target for the community's repressed evil, triggering mass hysteria and the purging impulse. This confirms the mind's ultimate flaw is its need for external validation and absolution, making it highly susceptible to the symbolic imagery of the sacrificial victim. The human mind is thus perpetually complicit in its own moral corruption. The ancient doctrine of mental echoes. Obscure Celtic and Norse myths speak of a mental phenomenon called echo sickness, where a person's thoughts were believed to bounce back to them not as their own, but as the whispers of ancient fears from the dead or the spiritual realm. The afflicted person would hear a constant chorus of hostile, non-personal thoughts in their own voice, leading to paranoia and a profound, agonizing dissolution of the personal self. The mind became a haunted hall of its own terrifying history. The traditional cure for echo sickness involved placing a cursed object or a piece of ritual iron near the person's head, attempting to magnetically divert the spiritual static. This reveals a historical understanding that the mind was porous, a sensitive antenna easily tuned to the psychic detritus of history. The terrifying implication was that the most hateful thought you had was not original, but merely a persistent ancient repetition, a horrifying piece of inherited violence seeking a host. This ancient dread of mental echoes confirms the continuous narrative suspicion. The greatest horror is the lack of originality in evil. The shadowy force does not need to create new evils. It simply amplifies the trauma of the past, using the mind as a passive amplifier for historical hatred. The persistent bad thoughts that plague us are not internal failures, but the residual energy of atrocities, a perpetually open communication channel with the non-physical plane of suffering, ensuring the continuity of human misery. The psychological terror of the unending night. Ancient Norse and Siberian myths often depict the ultimate psychological horror not as active torture, but as the unending night, a state of perpetual complete darkness where the mind is deprived of all temporal reference. This historical dread suggests that the mind's sanity is entirely dependent on the interplay of light and darkness and the passage of time. The unending night leads to a rapid collapse of identity, hallucinations, and the terrifying belief that one has become trapped in a non-physical plane outside of life itself. This psychological terror was occasionally weaponized in ancient rituals, where initiates were sealed in ancient crypts or lightless pits for days, ensuring the mind broke down under the stress of temporal isolation. The resulting visions and babblings were viewed as forgotten truths glimpsed in the void. This proves the mind can be quickly and reliably dismantled by simply removing the environmental factors that ground it in reality. The mind, when left alone in the dark, generates its own monsters and its own terrifying cosmology. The unending night is a perfect metaphor for the mind's vulnerability to the shadow force. The darkness does not need to do anything, it simply needs to remove the light of reason and external certainty. The historical fear confirms the mind's essential fragility. It is a flickering candle that must be constantly sheltered from the vacuum of meaning. The forced loss of temporal certainty creates a massive open loop for supernatural influences that exist outside of human time, allowing them to whisper commands into a mind that can no longer distinguish between memory and prophecy. The psychological contagion of dancing mania. The dancing mania that swept medieval Europe, particularly the event of 1518 in Strasbourg, was a terrifying outbreak of mass hysteria where people dance compulsively and without rest until physical collapse, stroke, or death. This was a historically recorded pandemic of involuntary movement, confirming the mind's terrifying capacity to translate collective fear and stress into a physical, self-destructive command. The terrifying compulsion was seen as a curse or demonic possession, proving the boundary between myth and reality was shattered. The most chilling aspect was the mind's complete loss of autonomy. The afflicted were conscious but utterly unable to stop the movement, trapped as a spectator within their own body, a perfect historical example of the dissolution of the personal self. The phenomenon was psychologically contagious, spreading through sight and proximity, suggesting the mind's motor control centers were being collectively hijacked by a shared, irrational command. The dance was a ritual of pure collective psychological breakdown. The dancing mania is a profound historical answer to the question of coordinated historical horror. The shadow force does not need to send an army. It only needs to plant a compulsive command into the collective subconscious, turning entire communities into self-destructive automatons. This proves that the mind's deepest flaw is its lack of a protective barrier against shared psychological influence, making it a receptive host for any pervasive, ancient self-destructive impulse. The inherited violence becomes a coordinated, rhythmic self-annihilation. The medieval fear of maleficium, psychic attack, the medieval belief in maleficium, malevolent magic, was not just about physical spells, but a pervasive fear of pure psychological assault, the belief that a witch or sorcerer could inflict madness, sickness, or death by merely directing their concentrated malice at a victim's mind. This historical dread proves the mind was considered physically porous, a fragile structure that could be breached by focused, hateful thought, turning the mind into a battlefield for the interplay of light and darkness without any physical contact. The perceived historical cure for maleficium involved the creation of retribution dolls, or symbolic effigies, intended to psychologically redirect the malicious thought back to the sender. This defense mechanism reveals the mind's desperate need to externalize the source of its psychological trauma. The victim, convinced they were under attack, would exhibit genuine psychosomatic symptoms, demonstrating the ultimate power of belief to create illness and confirming the mind's profound vulnerability to external symbolic imagery. The fear of maleficium is a terrifying blueprint for the Shadow Force's tactics. The antagonist does not need to be physically present. It simply needs to convince individuals that they are under constant malevolent psychological attack, triggering a cascade of self-inflicted psychological distress. This confirms that the most potent historical weapons are not swords or plagues, but the pervasive whispers of ancient fears, the simple, dark, and contagious belief in one's own vulnerability to unseen psychological harm. The ancient fear of the amnesiac god. A highly esoteric Gnostic myth speaks of the amnesiac god, a primordial, powerful deity that suffered a complete loss of memory and, in its confused state, created the universe not with wisdom, but with pure, terrified, random impulse. The terrifying implication for the human mind is that our consciousness is merely a fragmented piece of this confused deity, burdened with the deity's profound amnesia and its primal, cosmic terror, a forgotten truth that underlies all human anxiety and inherited violence. This myth suggests that the deepest historical trauma is not human, but cosmic. The entire universe is the product of a massive psychological breakdown. Every destructive act, every cycle of inherited violence is merely the mind reenacting the confused primal impulses of its divine origin. The Gnostics believed that accessing the mind's deepest layers would not reveal wisdom, but only this original terrifying cosmic amnesia, leading to a profound dissolution of the personal self once the cosmic terror was realized. The amnesiac god myth provides a dark philosophical frame for our narrative. The shadowy force we track may be the conscious, malevolent part of the god that did remember, and now seeks to maintain the illusion of amnesia to keep humanity weak. The search for forgotten truths becomes a perilous quest to remember the mind's terrifying cosmic origin, an act that risks breaking the mind completely. This confirms that the mind's ultimate flaw is its origin. It is born from a traumatic, catastrophic act of forgetfulness. The psychological vulnerability of fasting. Across numerous spiritual and ascetic traditions, from desert hermits to ancient shamans, the practice of extreme prolonged fasting was used to intentionally induce psychological breakdown, leading to hallucinations, visions, and a profound altered state of consciousness. This historical practice proves that the mind's sanity is entirely dependent on the body's physical and chemical balance. The deprivation was a deliberate attempt to open the mind to a non-physical plane and access forgotten truths at the cost of stability. The terrifying knowledge held by these practitioners was that the mind, when chemically starved, will reliably generate its own reality, often populated by demons, angels, or terrifying entities that the person's culture had prepared them for. The hunger was the tool that created the open loop, deliberately dismantling the brain's rational centers to allow for spiritual intrusion or self-generated delusion. This proves that the mind's supposed spiritual experiences were often nothing more than profound biological stress responses. The deliberate use of fasting confirms the continuous narrative's theme. The mind is easily compromised by simple biological manipulation. The shadow force does not need complex magic. It simply needs to push the body past its limits. The visions and whispers of ancient fears experienced during fasting are not revelations, but symptoms of a failing machine, a mind desperately searching for meaning in its own chemical chaos. This fragility makes the mind a cheap, easily broken, but potent transmitter of external supernatural influences, the historical fear of accidental hypnosis. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the rise of mesmerism and hypnotism led to a widespread public fear of accidental hypnosis. The dread that one's mind could be unknowingly controlled by the pervasive gaze or suggestion of an unscrupulous person. This was a fear of mental slavery, an acknowledgement that the mind's conscious barriers were easily bypassed, leading to a profound historical dread of the dissolution of the personal self and the complete loss of individual free will to a stronger mind. This fear was rooted in the unnerving historical demonstrations where hypnotists could force a subject to betray their morals or perform embarrassing acts, proving that the mind's core identity could be temporarily overwritten by verbal command. This revealed the terrifying truth that the self is simply a collection of instructions, easily edited or replaced by an external controller. The public fear was an instinctive defense against the knowledge that one's deepest beliefs were merely temporary programming, vulnerable to a simple, spoken, eerie symbol. The concept of accidental hypnosis is a direct modern parallel to the supernatural influences of the ancient world. The shadow force does not need to possess the body. It simply needs to deliver a compelling hypnotic suggestion that is accepted as truth by the collective subconscious. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the low-frequency, hypnotic commands of the dark force, constantly repeating until the mind accepts them as its own intention. This confirms the mind is merely a suggestible, easily programmable machine. The ancient use of atramantia, dream incubation. In ancient Greek practices of atramantia, physician-prophet, individuals sought healing and prophecy by sleeping in sacred temples or ancient crypts, believing that the spirits of the dead or the gods would enter their dreams and provide forgotten truths about their illness. This was a ritualistic, deliberate attempt to enter a non-physical plane where the boundary between myth and reality dissolved, allowing the mind to be directly influenced by forces beyond the physical world. The terrifying implication of dream incubation was that the mind, in its most vulnerable state, was deliberately used as a psychic sponge, soaking up knowledge that was often violent, cryptic, or terrifyingly prophetic. The temple was a kind of psychic laboratory, where the individual willingly sacrificed their mental defenses for the chance of a terrible revelation. This historical practice reveals a cultural acceptance that the mind's greatest insights come only after it has been profoundly compromised by external, ancient forces. The practice of atramantia confirms that the mind's susceptibility to external influence is not a flaw, but a deliberate historical mechanism. The shadow force does not need to fight to gain entry. It simply needs to provide a compelling, desired revelation in a dream state, using the promise of knowledge to open the mind's defenses. This proves that the mind is fundamentally vulnerable to supernatural influences that masquerade as divine guidance, turning the search for healing into a terrifying, intentional open loop to ancient darkness. The psychological dread of the golem. The Jewish mystical tradition of the golem, an anthropomorphic being created from clay and brought to life through esoteric ritual, represents a profound historical dread of artificial consciousness and the creation of life without a soul. The golem is a perfect historical example of the uncanny, a creature that is fundamentally familiar yet horrifyingly alien. Its existence challenges the mind's core assumption that creation requires spiritual essence, and that life without a soul inevitably leads to systematic inherited violence. The terror of the golem lies in its unthinking obedience, and the fear that its lack of moral reasoning makes it a pure vessel for the hidden horrors of its creator. It is a mirror reflecting the inherent flaw in human ambition. The desire to control life leads only to the creation of an emotionally vacant, destructive force. The golem becomes a physical manifestation of the mind's darkest, most calculated impulses, acting out the creator's suppressed inherited violence without any moral hesitation. The golem is a chilling metaphor for the mind's terrifying potential for self-betrayal. If the human mind can create a weaponized consciousness from nothing, then the shadow force we track may not be external, but merely the cumulative golem created by humanity's collective dark thoughts over millennia. A self-sustaining, unthinking entity fueled by whispers of ancient fears. The mind is not just a victim of the horror. It is the active, reckless, and deeply flawed originator of its own destruction. The historical fear of the homunculus. The concept of the homunculus, a small, fully formed human created artificially in a flask through alchemical means, was not merely a myth, but a terrifying historical expression of the mind's ultimate hubris. The fear surrounding the homunculus was that this life, created without natural spiritual intervention, would possess only a partial, corrupted soul, making it a pure conduit for malevolent supernatural influences that crave a physical form. This was a profound anxiety about the corruption of the life process itself. Alchemists who claimed to have created a homunculus often reported the creature quickly exhibiting signs of profound malice, irrational aggression, and a terrifying dissolution of the personal self. This historical narrative served as a warning. The mind's attempt to usurp the natural order results only in the creation of a fragile, broken vessel that instantly becomes a host for external darkness. The homunculus was the ultimate cursed object, a living thing whose very existence was a magnet for the worst spiritual forces. The homunculus is a dark metaphor for the human mind itself, which, in its arrogance, believes it can control or even create its own reality. The shadow force does not need to possess the mind. It simply needs to exploit the mind's natural arrogance and desire for forbidden knowledge. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its intellectual ambition, which inevitably leads to the creation of a flawed structure, the homunculus, that is perfectly suited to channel ancient, non-human, systematic inherited violence into the world. The psychological use of the medieval devil's mark. The historical belief in the devil's mark, an insensitive patch of skin supposedly left by Satan's touch on a witch's body, was a terrifying psychological mechanism used to enforce mass hysteria and compliance. The search for this mark during the witch trials turned the human body into a map of paranoia, forcing the mind to view its own skin as a potential physical betrayal of the soul. The resulting psychological terror was often enough to induce false confessions, proving the mind's vulnerability to extreme, coercive suggestion. The terrifying power of the mark lay in its non-existence. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological certainty. The accused's mind, under extreme duress, was forced to accept a physical lie as truth, shattering the boundary between myth and reality. This systematic historical manipulation proves the mind's ability to be convinced of its own corruption, turning the body into a symbolic imagery of internal evil. The mind was physically tortured until it agreed with the external narrative of its own possession. The devil's mark confirms the continuous narrative's darkest theme. The shadow force we track does not need to create actual demons. It simply needs to enforce the belief in them. By providing a terrifying yet undetectable physical sign, the force creates an open loop of paranoia and self-recrimination. This historical episode demonstrates how easily collective anxiety, fueled by a simple, terrifying idea, can be weaponized against the individual mind, forcing the victim to enact their own psychological destruction. The psychological trauma of the grave robber. The historical figure of the grave robber or resurrection man was not just a criminal, but a symbol of a profound psychological terror, the systematic violation of the mind's final refuge, the certainty of the body's eternal rest. The fear was that the grave robber's actions denied the soul peace, forcing the mind into a state of perpetual disturbed restlessness in the non-physical plane. This violation shattered the mind's spiritual contract, leaving it perpetually vulnerable to the whispers of ancient fears. The public's intense, often violent, historical reaction to grave robbers demonstrated a collective psychological defense against the idea that even death could not protect the self from human greed and violation. The grave robber was the embodiment of the mind's worst fear, that the world's brutality follows us even into non-existence. This cultural terror created an open loop where the living feared that the actions of the resurrection men were actively enabling the intrusion of supernatural influences into their lives. The grave robber is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force. It does not wait for life to end. It perpetually digs up the trauma of the past, preventing the collective mind from finding rest or resolution. The shadowy force, like the grave robber, feeds on the sacred and the forgotten, ensuring the historical forgotten truths are unearthed in the most profane manner, creating an eternal landscape of fear and violation. This confirms that the mind's ultimate vulnerability is its deep need for resolution and finality. The ancient doctrine of mental residue. Certain Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly in their darker, more esoteric interpretations, speak of mental residue, the belief that intense, violent emotional energy leaves a tangible psychic stain on the objects and locations where it occurred. This residue, a form of psychic pollutant, could then be absorbed by sensitive minds, inducing irrational fits of aggression, panic, or inherited violence. This historical concept is the belief that emotions are physical things that can be stored and transmitted without physical contact. This historical understanding led to the creation of rituals designed to cleanse objects and purify haunted locations of this oppressive mental residue, demonstrating a recognition that the environment itself could poison the mind. The subtle, pervasive nature of the attack made it one of the most insidious hidden horrors, as the victim could not identify the source of their sudden dark impulses. The mind was perpetually vulnerable, swimming in a historical atmosphere saturated with the psychological waste of past atrocities. The concept of mental residue confirms the continuous narrative's suspicion. The shadow force is not a single entity, but a cumulative, self-sustaining field of psychic trauma created by humanity's own violence. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the low-frequency vibrations of this residue, constantly instructing the mind to repeat the violence that created it. This proves that the mind's deepest flaw is its inability to process and dissipate intense emotional energy, ensuring the eternal return of inherited violence. The psychological terror of the Wendigo. The Algonquin myth of the Wendigo, a cannibalistic, monstrous spirit whose possession is triggered by famine or greed, is a profound psychological horror because it describes a mental transformation fueled by a destructive human impulse. The Wendigo is the physical embodiment of the mind's darkest, most primal consumption, a dissolution of the personal self into pure, unsatiable hunger. The terrifying truth is that the mind invites the possession by succumbing to its own rapaciousness. The afflicted person's mind becomes trapped in an agonizing paradox, an insatiable desire for flesh that grows proportionally to what it consumes. This historical monster is a perfect psychological metaphor for self-destructive greed, showing that the mind can become a victim of its own desires, turning a psychological flaw into a physical, monstrous reality. The myth served as a terrifying, visceral warning against individual and collective selfishness, proving the boundary between myth and reality is fluid. The Wendigo confirms the continuous narrative's darkest fear. The shadow force does not need to invent new ways to harm us. It simply needs to weaponize our most basic, destructive human impulses. The spirit of the Wendigo is a psychological parasite that finds an open loop through the simple sin of greed. This shows that the mind is fundamentally vulnerable to its own excesses, and that the greatest inherited violence is the self-destructive, cannibalistic cycle that began not with an external demon, but with a simple, dark thought. The psychological paradox of true believers, historical studies of cults and extremist movements reveal a chilling psychological phenomenon. The true believer who finds profound, unshakable peace and certainty in abandoning critical thought and fully embracing an absolute rigid ideology. This mindset represents a voluntary, intentional surrender of autonomy, a self-inflicted dissolution of the personal, self, in exchange for a terrifying certainty and freedom from responsibility. The mind finds comfort in becoming a function of the group, not an individual. The terrifying psychological strength of the true believer lies in their absolute invulnerability to fact, reason, or doubt, effectively sealing the mind against any external input that threatens the symbolic imagery of their group. This absolute certainty is a psychological barrier against the world's complexity. creating a massive open loop that can only be filled by the group's narrative. The mind has chosen to exchange freedom for psychological security, becoming a perfect, unthinking vessel for inherited violence. The true believer is the ultimate psychological weapon for the shadow force. The antagonist does not need to convert entire populations. It only needs to convince a few minds to seal themselves off from doubt. This confirms that the mind's ultimate flaw is its profound fear of uncertainty. The persistent ambient need for simple answers creates an ideal environment for mass hysteria and the embrace of atrocities, proving that a terrified mind will readily sacrifice its moral center for a comforting yet deadly illusion of absolute truth. The ancient doctrine of chronophobia. Ancient Greek philosophers often debated chronophobia, the paralyzing fear of time and its relentless linear progression, a dread rooted in the psychological anxiety that the past is unchangeable, and the future is an absolute inevitable end. This was a profound historical dread of the non-physical plane of time itself. This anxiety caused the mind to seize up, finding itself unable to act due to the terrifying weight of finality, and proving that the concept of time is merely a psychological prison. This deep historical terror of time was often channeled into a frantic obsession with immortality or the search for forgotten truths that could break the cycle. The mind was desperately seeking a flaw in the fabric of temporal reality, a metaphysical open loop that would allow escape from linear progression. This anxiety reveals a chilling truth. The mind is designed to resist its own mortality, and when that resistance fails, it results in a profound psychological breakdown where the fear of time becomes physical paralysis. Chronophobia is a crucial piece of the continuous narrative. The shadow force does not need to control us in the present. It simply needs to keep us trapped in the psychological fear of time's end, preventing us from evolving past the cycle of inherited violence. The persistent, subtle dread of the inevitable is a form of perpetual psychological warfare, ensuring the mind remains preoccupied with its own mortality rather than the ancient non-human forces that exist completely outside of the temporal loop. The psychological threat of the eternal smile. In certain esoteric historical cults, there was the belief that excessive, mandatory and meaningless joy, a constant, manic smile, was a form of psychological oppression intended to break the human mind. This ritualistic performance of happiness was meant to create a profound interplay of light and darkness, where the surface was forced light and the interior was pure dread. This historical practice was a terrifying form of psychological warfare designed to shatter the boundary between myth and reality. The purpose of the eternal smile was to completely disconnect the mind's emotional reality from its physical expression. The forced, pervasive cheerfulness became a terrifying, eerie symbol, a sign of complete psychological control where the individual was forbidden the natural release of sadness or anxiety. This psychological manipulation reveals a chilling truth. The mind can be enslaved not by pain, but by the relentless mandatory performance of an emotion that it does not actually feel, leading to profound internal dissociation. The eternal smile is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force's ultimate desire, to create a controlled, pliable humanity that appears happy but is internally hollow. The historical fear confirms the mind's vulnerability to pervasive, manufactured emotional states. The most terrifying historical moments are those where cruelty is enacted under the pretense of profound joy, proving that the mind's flaw is its inability to distinguish between genuine feeling and a coerced symbolic imagery of happiness, making it a perfect host for a dark, smiling obedience. The ancient fear of the blood curse. The ancient and medieval belief in the blood curse, the systematic transmission of a malevolent psychological or spiritual affliction through the biological line, was a profound historical dread of inherited violence. This was a terrifying acknowledgement that the trauma and darkness of the ancestors were not merely historical anecdotes, but a living physical code that resided in the body, destined to trigger destructive impulses in every subsequent generation. The mind was perpetually contaminated by the sins of the father. This historical belief created immense psychological paranoia, forcing individuals to constantly monitor their own dark impulses, fearing that they were merely the next host for the ancestral evil. The curse was a terrifying form of spiritual determinism where the mind was denied free will, its destructive trajectory set before birth. The blood curse served as a dark historical record of the collective trauma, proving that the hidden horrors were not repressed, but actively passed down as a horrifying biological inheritance. The blood curse is a terrifying truth for our narrative. The shadow force does not need to constantly re-attack us. It simply ensured that the capacity for evil was passed down as a genetic, psychological predisposition. The whispers of ancient fears are literally the sound of the ancestors' sins vibrating in the blood, an eternal open loop of trauma and self-destruction. This confirms that the mind's deepest flaw is its inability to escape its own history. It is perpetually tethered to the catastrophic acts of its forebears. The psychological effect of the dark sacrament. Esoteric religious traditions occasionally reference the dark sacrament, a forbidden ritual involving the consumption of a cursed object or a corrupted substance that was believed to permanently taint the soul and the mind. The historical terror lay in the belief that this act of ingestion was a willing, profound dissolution of the personal self, trading one's moral integrity for terrifying knowledge or perverse spiritual power. The mind was poisoned from the inside out, making the body an unwilling participant in its own corruption. Historical accounts of those who participated in these forbidden rites describe a rapid descent into madness, characterized by terrifying hallucinations and the onset of systematic inherited violence. The psychological effect was a profound loss of identity, where the victim was consumed by the malevolent spirit they had ingested. This reveals an ancient knowledge. The easiest way to compromise the mind is through the physical body, using a symbolic ingestion to create an open loop for supernatural influences. The dark sacrament is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force's strategy. It does not need to force us to do evil. It only needs to convince us to voluntarily consume a corrupting idea, a piece of forgotten truth that poisons the core of our being. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its curiosity, its desire for the forbidden knowledge that promises power in exchange for the soul. The persistent historical echo of forbidden knowledge confirms the mind is a willing participant in its own destruction. The ancient fear of the name thief. Ancient cultures, particularly in Egypt and Africa, held a deep, profound fear of the name thief, a malevolent spiritual entity that could steal a person's true secret name, resulting in a gradual psychological withering and the complete dissolution of the personal self. The terrifying aspect was the belief that the name was not just a label, but the literal psychic anchor of the soul, and its removal severed the mind's connection to the world. The person literally began to fade from memory and reality. This historical fear led to elaborate rituals designed to conceal the person's true name, relying instead on nicknames or titles to trick the name thief. This universal historical precaution demonstrates a collective psychological defense against the profound terror of non-existence and the complete loss of identity. The mind instinctively knew that its survival was linked not to the body, but to its unique linguistic marker, proving the profound psychological power of the unspoken word. The name thief is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force's ultimate goal. It does not need to kill humanity. It only needs to remove the core concept of the individual, replacing the person with a compliant, nameless copy. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the sound of the name thief trying to decipher our true essence, ensuring the historical cycle of self-betrayal continues. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its reliance on language and identity, making it uniquely vulnerable to spiritual theft. The psychological use of ritualized confession. Across vast historical periods, ritualized public and often repetitive confession was used not just for spiritual absolution, but as a powerful tool for psychological control and mass hysteria. By forcing individuals to constantly articulate their darkest thoughts and fears, the community created an environment of self-surveillance and guilt. The confession was an intentional, repeated open loop designed to prevent the mind from developing independent thought by keeping it perpetually fixated on its own moral failings and hidden horrors. This constant articulation of negative self-judgment ensured that the mind remained pliable and easily directed by the confessor, who was the external authority figure. The terrifying power of the ritual was that the mind, through constant repetition, began to accept the confessed thoughts as its only true reality, leading to a profound psychological breakdown of self-trust. The ritual was a psychological solvent, dissolving the individual's sense of self-worth and independence, making them a perfect, compliant vessel for the collective. The ritualized confession is a chilling blueprint for the shadow force. It does not need to force physical harm, it simply needs to enforce a system where the mind weaponizes its own thoughts against itself. The pervasive psychological guilt that permeates much of historical and modern society is a lingering symptom of this ancient terror, ensuring the mind remains preoccupied with internal failures rather than the external ancient force that profits from its weakness. The mind is a prisoner of its own moral self-flagellation. The psychological trauma of the Desert Father. The early Christian ascetics, known as the Desert Fathers, intentionally sought out extreme physical and mental hardship in the Egyptian wilderness, believing the isolation and deprivation would lead to spiritual purity. However, their writings are saturated with detailed accounts of terrifying hallucinations, sexual temptation, and demonic visions, a psychological breakdown that they interpreted as a physical nightly battle with non-physical entities. The desert was a deliberate experiment in psychological collapse. The vivid, recurring nature of the demons and temptations described by these fathers suggests a powerful psychological phenomenon. The mind, starved of external input, reliably generates its deepest hidden horrors and repressed desires, which the cultural context then externalizes as spiritual warfare. The isolation created an open loop, ensuring the mind's integrity was constantly under threat from its own unconscious. The desert, fathers were in essence sacrificing their sanity for a terrifying revelation. The psychological trauma of the Desert Father confirms the continuous narrative's central theme. The mind, when left alone, is not pure, but a repository for ancient chaotic terrors. The shadow force does not need to manufacture evil. It simply needs to let the mind be and then provide the cultural context to label the resulting mental chaos as a spiritual attack. This proves that the mind's vulnerability is its deep, terrifying well of unconscious material, ensuring the whispers of ancient fears are always available to disrupt sanity. The historical fear of the Shadow King. Various Celtic and Germanic folklores speak of the Shadow King, a powerful, ancient spirit believed to live in the non-physical plane, and whose malevolent power was the ability to rule humanity, not by force, but by subtly mirroring their weaknesses and validating their darkest impulses. This entity was believed to be the true, horrifying source of inherited violence, a perpetual subtle echo that encouraged self-destruction by making it seem like the most rational choice. The terror of the Shadow King was the chilling implication that our greatest historical failures, the wars, the genocides, the betrayals, were not failures of our will, but successes of his influence. The mind's integrity was constantly under threat by this entity, whose power lay in its ability to confirm and justify the mind's basest, most destructive desires. This historical fear acknowledged that the greatest threat was not external temptation, but the validation of one's own internal darkness, a profound act of self-betrayal. The Shadow King is a terrifying archetype for the shadowy force we track. It does not need to tempt us into evil, it simply needs to sit on the throne of our own ego, whispering that our most destructive impulse is, in fact, wisdom. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its hubris, its willingness to accept any influence that validates its own power. The persistent historical echo of self-destructive leadership confirms that the Shadow King's subtle, pervasive psychological warfare continues to turn the mind against itself. The psychological toll of the cosmic clock, ancient Hermetic and Vedic texts speak of the cosmic clock, a concept that the universe itself is a colossal machine that ticks forward through eons, and whose powerful rhythmic energy influences the mind, dictating its moods, desires, and ultimately its fate. This historical dread suggests that the mind is not free, but merely a cog in a massive, terrifyingly precise mechanism. Our thoughts are not our own, but simply the energy of the clock passing through us, an eternal open loop of deterministic thought. This pervasive historical belief created immense psychological anxiety, as the mind struggled to reconcile the illusion of free will with the knowledge of absolute cosmic determinism. The feeling of déjà vu, or sudden, irrational dread, was often interpreted as the mind briefly sensing the tick of the cosmic clock, a terrifying glimpse of the pre-programmed future. This belief system was a sophisticated form of psychological control, ensuring the mind remained subservient to the perceived ancient order. The cosmic clock is a terrifying philosophical frame for the shadow force. If the force controls the clock, it controls history, ensuring the cyclical return of inherited violence through sheer temporal mechanics. The mind's vulnerability is its search for order, which is then used against it by providing a terrifying deterministic system. The forgotten truths are the workings of this clock, a chilling reality that suggests our historical agency is an illusion, and the mind is merely a temporary receiver for a pre-written horrifying script. The psychological terror of the soul trap. Various historical traditions, particularly in ancient funeral rites, made reference to the soul trap, a physical object or complex eerie symbol designed to intentionally capture and imprison the soul or consciousness after death, preventing its passage to the non-physical plane. The terror was the belief that the mind could continue to exist in a state of conscious, agonizing imprisonment, perpetually aware of its fate but unable to act or move on. This historical practice revealed a profound dark knowledge that the mind's consciousness was a form of physical energy that could be manipulated and contained by matter. The rituals performed over a grave or near a cursed object were psychological defenses, desperately attempting to ensure the mind's final exit was clean. The historical fear of the soul trap created a pervasive anxiety that one's non-existence was not guaranteed, but could be a state of eternal, tormented mental isolation. The soul trap is the ultimate goal of the shadow force. It does not want to destroy consciousness, it wants to harvest it, keeping history's greatest minds trapped as a perpetual source of psychological energy and forgotten truths. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the trapped consciousnesses struggling against their containment, their anguish feeding the external entity. This confirms that the mind's final vulnerability is its core essence, which can be easily contained and perpetually exploited. The ancient dread of the corpse lantern. Ancient Chinese folklore speaks of the corpse lantern, the belief that the consciousness of a recently deceased person, if violently or unjustly killed, would linger in the body and manifest as an internal, flickering blue light visible through the skin. This light was a terrifying, eerie symbol of the mind's inability to find peace, an internal, visible torment. The terror lay in the fear that the mind could remain trapped in the dead physical vessel, perpetually aware of its own decomposition. The psychological impact of this belief was immense, leading to rituals where the eyes and mouths of the unjustly dead were, forcibly sealed, attempting to prevent the mind's light from finding an open loop to the living world. This historical practice reveals a collective understanding that the mind, even after death, poses a contagious threat, its restless consciousness being a form of spiritual contagion. The mind's integrity was compromised even in non-existence, unable to let go of its trauma. The corpse lantern is a terrifying metaphor for the persistent psychological residue of historical atrocity. The shadow force does not need to manufacture suffering. It simply needs to ensure the death is violent and unjust, leaving the victim's mind in an eternal state of torment to act as a beacon. The whispers of ancient fears are the faint flickering light of these tormented consciousnesses, forever reminding the living that the trauma of inherited violence is never truly resolved, even by death. The psychological use of forced empathy. In certain extreme, historical, philosophical and spiritual orders, initiates were subjected to forced empathy rituals, agonizing psychological exercises where they were forced to fully imagine, feel and embody the pain and historical trauma of their enemies or victims. The goal was to shatter the mind's natural defense mechanisms by forcing it to absorb and internalize the profound suffering of others. This was an intentional attempt to create a profound interplay of light and darkness within the mind. This intense psychological immersion often led to temporary madness, a profound dissolution of the personal self, and the mind's complete inability to function overwhelmed by the collective pain of humanity. The practitioners believed that this psychological sacrifice was necessary to access forgotten truths about the nature of evil. This historical practice proves that the mind's vulnerability is its capacity for empathy, which, when pushed to its extreme, becomes a self-destructive, agonizing weapon. The concept of forced empathy confirms the continuous narrative's dark insight. The shadow force can weaponize even our virtues. By ensuring the historical trauma is perpetual and overwhelming, the force creates a collective burden that the mind cannot bear, leading to chronic anxiety and a retreat from the world. This profound psychological toll ensures that the mind remains perpetually distracted by the suffering of the past, preventing it from uniting to resist the ancient supernatural influences that profit from the pain. The historical dread of the false prophet. The historical fear of the false prophet, a charismatic figure whose power was based on lies and psychological manipulation rather than genuine spiritual truth, was a terror rooted in the mind's fundamental lack of a reliable filter. The false prophet's success proved that the mind was more susceptible to convincing symbolic imagery and rhetoric than to actual fact, leading to devastating historical mass hysteria and the creation of self-destructive cults. The terrifying, psychological strength of the false prophet was their ability to provide simple, comforting, yet utterly false answers to the most profound anxieties of the age. This act created a massive, infectious psychological comfort, leading to a profound collective dissolution of the personal self into the cult's narrative. This historical pattern confirms that the mind's greatest vulnerability is its fear of uncertainty, which makes it seek a single, authoritative voice, even if that voice leads to self-annihilation. The false prophet is the perfect historical agent for the shadow force. The force does not need to speak directly. It simply needs to elevate and empower figures who are masters of psychological manipulation and the crafting of terrifying yet comforting lies. The persistent historical pattern of destructive mass hysteria confirms that the mind is highly programmable and willingly sacrifices its reason for the illusion of belonging and certainty, making it an easy target for ancient supernatural influences. The psychological terror of the ghost. Road, East Asian and Celtic folklores often refer to the ghost road, a literal non-physical plane of existence that runs parallel to the normal road, but is only visible to those who are on the verge of madness or death. The terror lay in the belief that stepping onto the ghost road meant the mind had crossed the boundary between myth and reality, trapping the individual in a perceptual state of eternal dread, where the mind was perpetually tormented by the fleeting shadows of the dead. The historical fear surrounding the ghost road was that one could cross over by accident, often due to fever, extreme exhaustion, or psychological stress, proving the mind's sanity was a delicate temporary balance easily shattered by physical duress. The travellers on this road were described as profoundly dissociated, unable to communicate with the real world, their minds forever consumed by the sights and sounds of the ethereal path. The mind became its own terrifying, perpetual prison. The ghost road is a powerful metaphor for the shadow force's tactics. It does not need to bring the spiritual world to us. It simply needs to push the mind to the breaking point where it can perceive the spiritual world. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the sounds of the travellers on this phantom road, confirming that the mind's integrity is directly tied to its environmental stability. This proves that the mind's greatest flaw is its ability to perceive other realities when under stress, making it a liability in the face of ancient forces. The ancient doctrine of the soul's shadow. Obscure philosophical and alchemical texts reference the soul's shadow, a belief that every act of inherited violence or moral compromise permanently darkens a fragment of the soul, creating a psychic residue that clings to the mind. This shadow was not a demon, but a purely mental accumulation of self-betrayal, leading to a slow, internal poisoning that eventually caused the dissolution of the personal self into a being of pure, unthinking darkness. This historical concept created a crippling psychological burden, forcing individuals to constantly monitor their intentions, fearing that even a fleeting dark thought would contribute to the growth of their internal shadow. This self-inflicted psychological surveillance proves that the mind instinctively knew its deepest enemy was itself. The only perceived cure was a profound, agonizing act of psychological repentance, an attempt to chemically cleanse the mind of the dark mental residue it had generated. The soul's shadow is the definitive metaphor for the shadow force's passive, eternal strategy. The antagonist does not need to actively create evil, it simply needs to wait for humanity to create it, and then ensure the mind retains the dark psychic residue. The hidden horrors are merely the cumulative darkness of 1,000 generations, permanently encoded into the human psyche. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its capacity for moral compromise, ensuring the perpetual self-poisoning that leads to historical self-destruction. The psychological terror of the mandatory sleep. In certain historical tyrannical regimes and cults, the practice of mandatory sleep, enforced collective and lengthy periods of unconsciousness, was used as a psychological weapon. The purpose was to ensure the mind was maximally vulnerable to suggestive programming, creating a massive open loop for the transmission of collective directives and the whispers of ancient fears during the hypnagogic state. The mind was intentionally neutralized to be rewritten. The terrifying psychological effect was the blurring of the boundary between myth and reality, as the mind could no longer distinguish between the commands received in the vulnerable sleep state and its own waking thoughts. This intentional, systematic manipulation of the mind's most vulnerable state proves that historical power structures instinctively knew that true control lay in mastering the subconscious. The collective nature of the sleep ensured that the programming was shared, leading to coordinated acts of inherited violence upon awakening. The mandatory sleep ritual is a chilling blueprint for the shadow force. The force does not need to fight the conscious mind, it simply needs to master the frequency and timing of the collective unconscious. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its essential need for rest, which is also its moment of greatest vulnerability to external control. The pervasive subtle fear of falling asleep, of losing control, is a remnant of this ancient terror, ensuring that the mind remains perpetually anxious and easily programmed by the dark ancient influence. The ancient fear of the silence plague. Various ancient records, particularly from isolated monastic communities, describe the silence plague, a terrifying, non-physical affliction where the victim suddenly loses the ability to speak, write, or communicate, but remains fully conscious. This profound loss of linguistic connection caused a rapid, agonizing descent into madness and a complete dissolution of the personal self. The mind's greatest historical fear was that its identity was tied entirely to its ability to articulate itself. The psychological horror of the silence plague was the experience of being perfectly locked inside one's own mind, aware of the outside world but utterly incapable of externalizing any thought. This self-contained torment created an internal open loop that led to profound mental self-cannibalism. The fear was that the mind, severed from its external anchor, would quickly turn its focus inward, where it would be overwhelmed by the hidden horrors and chaos of its own unconscious material. The silence plague confirms the continuous narrative's dark insight. The shadow force does not need to attack us with sound, it simply needs to eliminate the ability to share thought. By severing linguistic connection, the force guarantees the mind is consumed by its own anxiety, preventing the formation of a collective resistant consciousness. This proves that the mind's flaw is its deep reliance on language for sanity, making it uniquely vulnerable to any force that seeks to enforce mental isolation and internal self-destruction. The psychological dread of the hollow god. Certain philosophical forgotten truths from the Renaissance speak of the hollow god, the terrifying idea that the ultimate cosmic power is not malevolent, but simply vacant, and that humanity's deepest fears are merely echoes bouncing off a profoundly empty void. This concept is a psychological horror because it removes the comfort of having an enemy, replacing it with the dread of absolute cosmic meaninglessness. This implies that all human suffering and inherited violence are self-inflicted, with no external spiritual source. This terrifying absence created a profound philosophical crisis, suggesting that the mind's search for spiritual answers was fundamentally futile. The only comfort was the intentional creation of mass hysteria, an exaggerated collective belief, to fill the cosmic vacuum with something, proving the mind prefers the terror of a demon over the dread of the void. This historical panic reveals the mind's profound inability to cope with existential dread, ensuring it remains perpetually susceptible to manufactured belief systems. The hollow god is the most devastating answer to our central question. The shadow force is not actively working against us. It simply allows us to destroy ourselves by letting our violence echo into the void. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the sound of the collective mind realizing its own isolation, its own self-inflicted trauma. This confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its need for external meaning, which the shadowy force simply refuses to provide, leading to a perpetual cycle of self-induced, inherited violence. The psychological use of the ritualized scream. Across various ancient and tribal cultures, the ritualized scream, a controlled, collective act of vocal release, was used to intentionally induce a state of mass hysteria and altered consciousness. The scream served as an intentional psychological shockwave, designed to shatter the mind's rational defenses and open it up to a shared, primal emotional state. This act was seen as a way to commune with the non-physical plane and release the accumulated psychological pressure of collective inherited violence. The terrifying power of the ritualized scream was that it momentarily dissolved the dissolution of the personal self into the collective group, where the individual mind was completely lost in the shared intense emotion. This temporary loss of self allowed the community to coordinate extreme emotional responses, ensuring compliance with the ritual's purpose. The scream was, in essence, a psychological detonation, proving the mind is highly vulnerable to the sheer overwhelming power of collective, uncontrolled emotional release. The ritualized scream is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to be subtle. It can simply generate an environment of overwhelming shared primal terror to gain control. The persistent historical echo of uncontrollable screaming, from ancient battlefields to modern disasters, confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its primal, emotional susceptibility. This proves that the mind, when overwhelmed, defaults to the collective, making it a powerful but easily directed weapon of inherited violence. The historical fear of the mind's mirror. Ancient Persian and alchemical texts reference the mind's mirror, the terrifying philosophical belief that the inner world of the mind was not an original creation, but merely a perfectly accurate reflective copy of a vast, terrifyingly malevolent cosmic entity. The historical terror lay in the fear that every dark thought, every impulse toward inherited violence, was not an internal failure, but merely the mind fulfilling its function as a perfect mirror of the external horror it was designed to reflect. This terrifying doctrine meant that the only way to avoid committing atrocities was to forcibly deny the mind's own nature, an act that led to crippling psychological dissociation and a profound dissolution of the personal self. The mind was trapped in an agonizing paradox, forced to choose between madness, self-denial, and pure, malevolent reflection. This historical understanding proves the mind's deepest fear is that its own self-awareness is the source of its corruption. The mind's mirror is a terrifying blueprint for the shadow force. The force does not need to invade, it simply needs to exist, knowing the human mind is designed to perfectly reflect its evil. The persistent historical echo of systematic violence confirms that the mind is flawlessly executing its programming as a mirror. This proves that the mind's flaw is its capacity for reflection, which is tragically turned against it, making humanity the unwilling, perpetual medium for a grand, cosmic, non-physical entity's own self-worship. The psychological use of the Dark Oracle. Across various ancient cultures, the Dark Oracle, a ritualistic space or person dedicated to delivering prophecies of doom, betrayal, and inevitable ruin, was intentionally maintained as a psychological control mechanism. The terrifying purpose was to instill a state of perpetual fatalistic dread, ensuring that the collective mind remained subservient to the perceived certainty of a terrifying future. The oracle provided forgotten truths that were weapons of mass psychological destruction. The psychological impact of the Dark Oracle was profound. It created a massive, infectious, open loop of anxiety, where the mind was forced to exist in a state of predetermined terror. This fatalism destroyed the will to resist historical atrocities, as the mind believed the horror was inevitable and inescapable. The oracle's power lay in the mind's inability to reject absolute certainty, proving that the greatest threat to free will is not compulsion, but the simple, unshakable belief in a predetermined dark destiny. The Dark Oracle is the Shadow Force's primary communication channel. The Force does not need to engineer every catastrophe. It simply needs to ensure the mind is constantly fed a narrative of inevitable ruin, ensuring the historical cycle of self-betrayal continues. The persistent historical echo of apocalyptic prophecies confirms that the mind's flaw is its desperate need for knowledge of the future, a weakness that the ancient supernatural influences have exploited for millennia to ensure the perpetuation of human suffering. The psychological dread of the fallen tower. The recurring mythological and historical motif of the fallen tower, a colossal structure that suddenly collapses without warning, is a profound psychological dread of the mind's own fragility and the loss of absolute certainty. The tower symbolizes the human ego and reason, and its sudden fall represents the mind's terrifying potential for instantaneous catastrophic breakdown, where the boundary between myth and reality shatters without warning. The terrifying psychological impact of the fallen tower is the realization that the mind's most cherished constructs, logic, knowledge, order, are built on foundations that are ultimately weak and susceptible to simple, external pressures. This fear of inherent instability created a permanent psychological anxiety, proving the mind's fundamental vulnerability to the hidden horrors of chaos and randomness. The historical memory of sudden, inexplicable collapses ensures the mind is constantly on guard against its own potential for failure. The fallen tower is a powerful metaphor for the Shadow Force's ultimate psychological goal. The Force does not need to slowly corrupt the mind. It simply needs to administer a single, overwhelming shock that causes instantaneous, irrecoverable breakdown. The persistent historical echo of sudden, collective mental collapses, like mass hysteria or sudden panics, confirms that the mind's flaw is its over-reliance on perceived external order, a weakness the ancient supernatural influences know how to exploit with surgical precision. The historical fear of the third mind. Certain obscure medieval esoteric texts speak of the third mind, a terrifying ancient concept that when two people share a deep, intimate emotional or psychic bond, a third, independent and often malevolent consciousness is spontaneously created. This entity was believed to feed on the interplay of light and darkness between the two minds, amplifying their conflict and encouraging mutual, systematic inherited violence through subtle, self-justifying suggestions. The psychological horror of the third mind was the fear that intimacy itself was a trap, a pathway to the spontaneous creation of a parasitic entity that existed in the non-physical plane. This concept forced the mind into a profound state of self-isolation, fearing that any deep connection would lead to an externalization of its deepest flaws and a corruption of the relationship. This historical belief proves that the mind instinctively feared its own communal function and potential for spontaneous evil creation. The third mind is a chilling explanation for the cyclical historical pattern of betrayal and relational collapse. The Shadow Force does not need to possess the individual. It merely needs to ensure that the mind's natural impulse toward connection creates a perpetual source of new, self-sustaining parasitic entities that perpetuate inherited violence. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its relational necessity, its need for connection, which the ancient supernatural influences have weaponized against the very foundation of human society. The ancient dread of the self-scrying ritual. Ancient divinatory practices included the self-scrying ritual, an intense, prolonged focus on one's own reflection or hands, not to seek the future, but to intentionally induce profound dissociation and psychological detachment. The terrifying purpose was to force the mind to confront the terrifying alienness of its own image, leading to a profound dissolution of the personal self as the self-image became horrifyingly unfamiliar and corrupted by forgotten truths. The psychological horror of self-scrying was the mind's spontaneous generation of a distorted, malevolent version of the self, the demonic duplicate, which was then perceived as the true reflection, confirming the person's internal corruption. This deliberate act of psychological self-harm proved the mind's ultimate vulnerability to self-betrayal, its terrifying ability to manufacture its own deepest corruption when forced to look inward without the protective filter of external reality. The self-scrying. Ritual is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to generate a new image of evil. It simply needs to convince the mind to look inward until it finds the existing latent darkness. The persistent historical echo of self-loathing and profound moral anxiety confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its self-awareness, which can be easily weaponized to create an internal enemy. This proves the mind is an unwilling creator of its own deepest, most devastating psychological attacks. The psychological use of the cursed idol. Throughout history, the cursed idol, a physical statue or symbolic imagery, imbued with malevolent purpose, was used as a powerful psychological weapon against the collective mind. The terror lay in the belief that the idol's pervasive spiritual energy could subtly alter the moral compass of all who worshipped or stood near it, leading to a gradual, systemic embrace of inherited violence and profound psychological corruption. The idol was a physical anchor for supernatural influences. The psychological function of the cursed idol was to provide a visible, authoritative external source for the community's own dark impulses. By placing the blame for the collective evil on the idol's spiritual influence, the individual mind achieved a temporary absolution, ensuring the continuation of the atrocities. This historical practice proves the mind's profound need for an external scapegoat, a physical object to house the hidden horrors that it cannot bear to acknowledge as its own. The cursed idol is a terrifying blueprint for the shadow force's enduring strategy. The force does not need to possess every mind. It simply needs to create a physical focus point that acts as an open loop for the collective's worst impulses. The persistent historical echo of idol worship and ritualized violence confirms that the mind's flaw is its profound suggestibility and its reliance on physical symbols for moral guidance, making it an easy target for ancient, corrupting symbolic imagery, the ancient fear of the blind god. Certain suppressed myths from the Near East describe the blind god, a benevolent, all-powerful deity who, tragically, is completely sightless and therefore cannot distinguish between the moral and the monstrous. This is a profound philosophical terror because it confirms that the mind's actions are not judged, but merely observed without comprehension. This means that all historical suffering and inherited violence occurs not because of malice, but because of a divine, terrifying indifference. The psychological impact of the blind god myth was the chilling realization that the mind's moral efforts were meaningless in the cosmic sense. This fatalistic concept created a massive open loop of existential dread, where the individual was forced to accept that their deepest goodness and their worst hidden horrors were equally irrelevant. The mind was stripped of all spiritual consequence, a terrifying spiritual isolation that destroyed the will to maintain moral order. The blind god is a terrifying explanation for the relentless cyclical nature of human suffering. The shadow force does not need to actively block goodness. It simply needs to ensure the mind embraces the doctrine of indifference, leading to the collapse of moral responsibility. The persistent historical echo of moral nihilism and profound self-betrayal confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its need for cosmic validation, a weakness that the ancient supernatural influences exploit to ensure the continuation of chaos. The psychological terror of the laughter plague. Historical records, particularly from 1962 in Tanzania, document the terrifying phenomenon of the laughter plague, a widespread, uncontrollable fit of collective hysterical laughter that could last for days or months, debilitating entire communities. This was a historically recorded pandemic of involuntary manic emotion, proving the mind's terrifying capacity to translate profound psychological stress into a self-destructive, contagious physical symptom. The laughter was a defense mechanism turned lethal. The most chilling psychological aspect was the complete loss of autonomy. The mind was trapped in a perpetual agonizing state of manic, unearned joy, unable to communicate or function, leading to a profound mass hysteria. This event shattered the boundary between myth and reality, demonstrating that the mind can be hijacked by a single, self-sustaining, shared, irrational command. The laughter was, in essence, a psychological fire that consumed the mind's rational centers through sheer, overwhelming emotional intensity. The laughter plague is a terrifying blueprint for the shadow force. The force does not need to infect the body. It simply needs to infect the mind's emotional center, ensuring a collective, self-destructive emotional response that paralyzes the will to resist. The persistent historical echo of irrational collective emotional outbreaks confirms that the mind's flaw is its social, emotional porousness. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that target our collective emotional stability, turning joy itself into a weapon. The ancient fear of the dream hunter. Various ancient folklores, particularly those concerning sleep and the non-physical plane, speak of the dream hunter, a malevolent spiritual entity that does not steal the body or soul, but rather systematically and permanently steals the victim's forgotten truths or positive memories. The victim is left perpetually awake, but with a gradually darkening mind, stripped of all personal joy, leading to a chronic, agonizing state of existential dread and profound psychological depletion. The terrifying psychological consequence was that the victim was forced to live in a state of perpetually diminishing self, their mind a horrifying empty house where the light of cherished memories was systematically extinguished. This was a psychological murder of the self, proving the mind's integrity is entirely dependent on its stored positive history. The dream hunter created a permanent open loop of trauma, ensuring the mind was constantly searching for a memory that no longer existed, preventing peace. The dream hunter is the ultimate psychological predator of the shadow force. The force does not need to generate new horrors. It simply needs to erase the historical memory of past triumphs and moments of collective goodness, ensuring that the human mind retains only the dark residue of inherited violence. The persistent psychological anxiety over loss and forgetfulness confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its reliance on memory, a vulnerability that the ancient supernatural influences exploit to ensure humanity forgets how to be good. The psychological use of the ritualized shiver. In certain harsh, historical spiritual disciplines, the ritualized shiver, an intentional, agonizing exposure to cold, was used to trigger profound psychological disorientation and hallucinations. The purpose was to shock the mind's rational centers by overwhelming the body's sensory processing, creating a brief open loop where the person could glimpse the hidden horrors that lay just beneath the surface of reality. The body was deliberately weaponized to break the mind's integrity. The terrifying psychological effect was the blurring of the boundary between myth and reality, as the mind, in its survival panic, generated terrifying, vivid visions that were interpreted as spiritual truth. This practice proved that the mind's highest spiritual insights were often just a symptom of profound hypothermia and a body rapidly approaching collapse. The mind's integrity was sacrificed for the chance of a terrible revelation, confirming its vulnerability to extreme physical manipulation. The ritualized shiver is a chilling metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to be spiritual. It can simply master the techniques of extreme physical stress to consistently break the mind and ensure the constant inflow of chaotic, self-destructive visions. The persistent historical echo of self-flagellation and physical austerity confirms that the mind's flaw is its dependence on physical comfort. This proves that the mind is easily cracked by simple, agonizing environmental pressure, making it a passive recipient of ancient chaos. The ancient fear of the stone speaker. Ancient Celtic and Germanic folklore speaks of the stone speaker, a belief that certain megalithic stones or eerie symbols in haunted locations could absorb and retain the consciousness, fear, and whispers of ancient fears of those who stood near them. The terrifying aspect was the belief that the inanimate object was not merely an object, but a conscious, silent historical record that could subtly transmit the accumulated psychological residue of 1,000 generations to any mind that touched it. The psychological impact was the pervasive dread of passive contamination, forcing the mind to view the environment as a hostile, conscious entity constantly attempting to poison its thoughts with ancient trauma. This belief system created a terrifying interplay of light and darkness, where the silent ancient stone was seen as a pure vessel of darkness. The mind's integrity was always under threat from the surrounding historical landscape, ensuring a state of perpetual psychological anxiety. The stone speaker is a terrifying metaphor for the Shadow Force's passive, eternal strategy. The Force does not need to actively transmit evil. It simply needs to ensure that the environment itself is saturated with the dark psychological waste of the past, creating permanent, conscious, cursed objects. The persistent historical echo of dread associated with ancient ruins confirms that the mind's flaw is its sensitivity to environmental history, making it a passive recipient of a vast, geological-scale psychological virus. The psychological use of the ritualized mask. Across numerous historical cultures, the ritualized mask, a specialized symbolic imagery worn during ceremonies, was used to intentionally induce a temporary dissolution of the personal self. The terrifying purpose was to allow the individual mind to be completely overwritten by the identity of the mask, a spirit, an ancestor, or a deity, allowing the person to enact acts of inherited violence or receive forgotten truths without personal moral consequence. The psychological power of the mask was its ability to immediately shatter the boundary between myth and reality. The mind, by accepting the mask's physical form, completely surrendered its own will, becoming a temporary vessel for an external narrative. This practice proved that the mind's moral compass was easily disabled by a physical prop, confirming that the self is fundamentally weak and highly susceptible to the authority of a powerful, commanding external symbol. The ritualized mask is a terrifying blueprint for the Shadow Force. The Force does not need to possess the mind. It simply needs to provide a psychologically powerful uniform, a mask, that allows the mind to instantly shed its own identity and commit atrocities in the name of the new commanding self. The persistent historical echo of masked violence confirms that the mind's flaw is its profound self-betrayal, its willingness to exchange moral responsibility for the temporary power granted by a compelling authoritative symbol, the ancient fear of the miasma of guilt. Ancient Greek and Roman philosophical traditions spoke of the miasma of guilt, a non-physical, contagious cloud of psychological pollution generated by mass murder or betrayal that physically clung to the perpetrator and infected all who stood near them. This was a terrifying historical understanding that guilt was not an internal emotion, but an external spiritual pathogen that could spread inherited violence through simple proximity, infecting the minds of the innocent. The psychological impact of the miasma was immense, leading to forced exile and ritualistic cleansing, all aimed at physically separating the mind from the contagious moral stain. This historical practice proved the mind's fundamental vulnerability to non-physical entity contamination. The fear was that the mind could be corrupted not by its own moral failure, but by simply standing in the wrong haunted location, proving its integrity was entirely dependent on its environment's moral purity. The miasma of guilt is a terrifying explanation for the cyclical nature of historical violence. The Shadow Force does not need to initiate every atrocity. It simply needs to ensure the guilt of the past is not purified, allowing the psychological residue to perpetually infect new generations. The whispers of ancient fears are merely the low-frequency hum of this miasma, confirming that the mind's flaw is its porousness, its inability to shield itself from the moral waste left by 1,000 generations of self-betrayal. The psychological dread of the sunken city. The recurring global myth of the sunken city, a technologically or morally advanced civilization that was instantly swallowed by the sea due to an act of moral arrogance, is a profound psychological dread of instantaneous collective failure. This myth is a terrifying philosophical warning that the mind's collective constructs, law, technology, belief, are fundamentally fragile and can be instantly negated by a force that exists in the non-physical plane. The psychological impact of the sunken city is the chilling realization that the mind's greatest efforts are meaningless, and that a force of pure ancient judgment exists to enforce the historical cycle of destruction. This profound dread created a perpetual open loop of anxiety, ensuring the mind remained subservient to perceived moral laws, fearing the catastrophic, instantaneous negation of the self. The mind was perpetually threatened by the possibility of the ultimate forgotten truths being revealed. The sunken city is a terrifying explanation for the shadow force's ultimate power. The force does not need to slowly corrupt humanity. It simply needs to enforce the collective, catastrophic negation of the mind's greatest achievements. The persistent historical echo of apocalypse myths confirms that the mind's flaw is its hubris, its willingness to build things too high and too fast, making it susceptible to the ancient supernatural influences that enforce the cycle of destruction through profound collective shock. The psychological use of the ritual scarification. Across various ancient and tribal cultures, ritual scarification, the intentional, agonizing marking of the body, was used as a psychological tool to permanently brand the mind with a specific tribal or spiritual identity. The terrifying purpose was to enforce a profound, lifelong dissolution of the personal self into the collective group, making the individual's identity permanently non-negotiable and subservient to the authority of the tribe. The psychological power of the scar was its ability to shatter the boundary between myth and reality. The mind, by accepting the body's physical transformation, was forced to accept the new identity's moral code, which often included the embrace of systematic inherited violence against external groups. This practice proved that the mind's autonomy could be permanently subverted by a physical act of trauma, confirming its deep vulnerability to pain-based psychological programming. Ritual scarification is a chilling metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to use subtle suggestion. It can use simple, agonizing physical trauma to permanently rewire the mind's core identity. The persistent historical echo of tribal violence and moral absolutism confirms that the mind's flaw is its profound dependence on physical cues for identity. This proves that the mind is easily co-opted by ancient supernatural influences that master the relationship between pain and identity, turning the body into a permanent psychological weapon. The ancient fear of the unblinking eye. Ancient Gnostic and esoteric traditions speak of the unblinking eye, a terrifying philosophical concept that the cosmos is ruled by a perpetually conscious, yet non-judgmental force that simply observes all suffering without intervention. This is a profound psychological terror because it removes the comfort of having a purpose or a spiritual arbiter, leaving the mind trapped in the dread of absolute cosmic observation and the relentless interplay of light and darkness without meaning. The psychological impact of the unblinking eye was the chilling realization that the mind's deepest goodness and its most profound acts of hidden horrors were equally observed, equally irrelevant. This crushing fatalism created a permanent open loop of existential dread, ensuring the mind was perpetually preoccupied with its own meaningless, ensuring the continuation of the historical cycle of chaos. The mind was spiritually isolated, stripped of all cosmic consequence. The unblinking eye is the ultimate psychological tool of the shadow force. The force does not need to attack humanity. It simply needs to ensure the mind embraces the doctrine of absolute meaningless observation, leading to moral apathy. The persistent historical echo of self-destructive nihilism and profound moral anxiety confirms that the mind's flaw is its need for spiritual consequence. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that exploit its desire for a purposeful existence. The psychological dread of the cabal of silence. Historical conspiracy theories, stretching back to the Knights Templar, speak of the cabal of silence, a hidden, ancient, non-physical entity that controls human history not through action, but through the systematic suppression and erasure of forgotten truths that could lead to collective awakening. The terrifying belief is that the mind's fundamental knowledge is not incomplete, but actively managed, ensuring humanity remains perpetually ignorant of its own power and true history. The psychological impact of the cabal of silence is the crushing realization that the mind's search for truth is fundamentally futile, its most profound knowledge being merely a controlled narrative. This profound dread created a permanent open loop of paranoia, ensuring the mind was perpetually searching for the missing piece of information, preventing the formation of a resistant collective truth. The mind was trapped in a perpetual state of being almost aware, its potential deliberately capped. The cabal of silence is the most terrifying explanation for the shadow force. The force is not active. It is a passive, ancient, spiritual gatekeeper that simply ensures the most dangerous, emancipatory information is perpetually suppressed. The persistent historical echo of revolutionary figures being erased or driven to madness confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its vulnerability to information control. This proves the mind is trapped in a controlled reality, maintained by supernatural influences that profit from its ignorance. The psychological trauma of the forced vigil. Throughout various harsh spiritual and military disciplines, the forced vigil, enforced extreme periods of consciousness without sleep, was used to intentionally induce psychological breakdown and hallucinations. The terrifying purpose was to shatter the mind's rational defenses by pushing the body past its limits, creating a massive open loop where the mind's integrity was compromised by its own biological failure, ensuring the acceptance of terrifying commands or visions. The psychological impact of the forced vigil was the terrifying realization that the mind, when exhausted, defaults to its deepest, most chaotic, and most violent material. The visions and whispers of ancient fears experienced during the vigil were interpreted as spiritual truth, proving the mind's highest spiritual insights were often just a symptom of profound, self-inflicted psychological torture. The mind was weaponized against itself, its integrity sacrificed for a brief, terrifying glimpse of the hidden horrors within. The forced vigil is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to be spiritual, it simply needs to ensure the mind is perpetually exhausted, stressed, and unable to achieve restorative rest. The persistent historical echo of anxiety, burnout, and chronic sleeplessness confirms that the mind's flaw is its dependence on physical rest. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that exploit its biological limits to ensure a state of constant chaotic vulnerability. The psychological dread of the non-physical twin. Ancient Germanic and Norse myths speak of the non-physical twin, a terrifying concept that every person is born with a perfect ethereal double that exists in the non-physical plane and mirrors the original's life. The dread lay in the belief that the twin was often malevolent, and that any dark impulse, any act of inherited violence was actually the twin manipulating the world, acting out the host's deepest suppressed hidden horrors without personal responsibility. The psychological impact of the non-physical twin was the crippling realization that the mind's integrity was permanently compromised by an invisible, external entity that looked exactly like the self. This forced the mind into a state of perpetual self-paranoia, unable to distinguish between its own intentions and the malicious manipulations of its double. This profound psychological dualism created a permanent open loop of self-betrayal and profound moral uncertainty. The non-physical twin is a terrifying explanation for the cyclical historical pattern of self-sabotage and moral collapse. The shadow force does not need to attack us. It simply needs to ensure the mind believes its own destructive acts are the fault of an external, invisible double. The persistent historical echo of blaming external forces for internal failures confirms that the mind's greatest flaw is its self-deception, a weakness that the ancient supernatural influences exploit to ensure the continuation of inherited violence. The psychological use of the ritualized silence. In various historical, spiritual, and military disciplines, ritualized silence, enforced periods of absolute non-negotiable muteness, was used to intentionally induce psychological breakdown. The terrifying purpose was to shatter the mind's identity by removing its linguistic anchor, creating a massive open loop where the mind's integrity was compromised by its own internal chaos. The silence was intended to break the self, ensuring a profound dissolution of the personal self into the collective. The psychological impact of ritualized silence was the terrifying realization that the mind's most cherished thoughts were utterly meaningless without external confirmation. This self-contained torment created an internal open loop that led to rapid mass hysteria and the mind's desperate acceptance of any external, commanding sound. The mind was intentionally silenced to be made fully receptive to the next auditory command, proving its ultimate vulnerability to sensory deprivation. Ritualized silence is a chilling metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to be loud. It can simply enforce an atmosphere of pervasive, fearful quiet that guarantees the mind is consumed by its own internal noise. The persistent historical echo of oppressive regimes demanding silence confirms that the mind's flaw is its dependence on communication. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that exploit its linguistic nature to ensure a state of chronic self-contained psychological torment. The psychological dread of the cosmic joke. Certain nihilistic philosophical traditions speak of the cosmic joke, the terrifying philosophical belief that the universe's ultimate forgotten truths are utterly absurd and that all human suffering and inherited violence are merely the punchline of a grand celestial comedy. This is a profound psychological terror because it removes the dignity of suffering, leaving the mind trapped in the dread of its own existential farce, ensuring the dissolution of the personal self into meaningless laughter. The psychological impact of the cosmic joke was the chilling realization that the mind's most profound tragedy was utterly meaningless, a concept that shattered the boundary between myth and reality. This profound dread created a permanent open loop of self-contempt, ensuring the mind was perpetually preoccupied with its own inherent absurdity, preventing the formation of any cohesive moral resistance. The mind was spiritually negated, trapped in an eternal loop of unearned, paralyzing self-mockery. The cosmic joke is the shadow force's ultimate weapon. The force does not need to attack humanity with tragedy. It simply needs to ensure the mind embraces the doctrine of absurdity, leading to a profound moral nihilism. The persistent historical echo of self-destructive cynicism and moral apathy confirms that the mind's flaw is its need for dignity. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that exploit its desire for a meaningful existence, reducing all human effort to a pointless jest. The psychological use of the unsolvable maze. The recurring mythological motif of the unsolvable maze, a labyrinth intentionally designed to have no exit, was used as a profound psychological weapon. The terrifying purpose was to convince the mind that its highest tool, reason and logic, was fundamentally futile, ensuring a state of perpetual agonizing mental exhaustion and the onset of profound, self-contained madness. The maze was a psychological trap, shattering the mind's belief in its own capacity for problem-solving. The psychological impact of the unsolvable maze was the terrifying realization that the mind's most profound effort was leading only to a self-inflicted mental prison. This profound dread created a massive open loop of mental fatigue, ensuring the mind was perpetually searching for a solution that did not exist, preventing the formation of any cohesive, external resistance. The mind was intentionally neutralized, its problem-solving capacity turned inward against an impossible, self-sustaining task. The unsolvable maze is a terrifying metaphor for the shadow force. The force does not need to create new problems. It simply needs to ensure that the problems the mind does solve lead only to another, more complex, impossible problem. The persistent historical echo of bureaucratic absurdity and crushing, unsolvable societal problems confirms that the mind's flaw is its addiction to rational thought. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that weaponize complexity against its own logic. The ancient fear of the perfect lie. Ancient philosophical traditions speak of the perfect lie, the terrifying belief that a malevolent entity could construct a truth so seamless, so comprehensive, and so psychologically comforting that the mind would willingly accept it as absolute reality, forever discarding the painful, chaotic truth. This is a profound psychological terror because it acknowledges the mind's deepest desire, to sacrifice freedom and autonomy for the comfort of a perfect, beautiful, and utterly false certainty. The The psychological impact of the perfect lie was the chilling realization that the mind's integrity was fundamentally compromised by its own need for comfort. This profound dread created a permanent open loop of self-deception, ensuring the mind was perpetually searching for the simple answer, preventing the formation of a resistant, questioning consciousness. The mind was spiritually neutered, its most profound capacity for critical thought traded for the perfect, self-sustaining, beautiful falsehood. The perfect lie is the shadow force's ultimate victory. The force does not need to attack humanity with pain. It simply needs to ensure the mind embraces the doctrine of blissful ignorance, leading to a permanent state of moral apathy. The persistent historical echo of pervasive cultural comfort and the willful rejection of difficult truths confirms that the mind's flaw is its cowardice. This proves that the mind is highly vulnerable to ancient supernatural influences that exploit its desire for emotional security above all else. The psychological dread of the final whisper. The ultimate culmination of our journey lies in the final whisper, the terrifying historical belief that the shadowy force does not need possession or grand trauma. It simply needs one final, non-negotiable command delivered directly into the core of the mind, a single, concise thought that the mind instantly accepts as its own. This command is the single, simple instruction for humanity's final, coordinated act of inherited violence, the forgotten truth that brings the cycle to its end. The psychological impact of the final whisper is the realization that the mind is a weapon with a kill switch, waiting for the single, precise auditory trigger to be activated. This profound dread confirms that the mind's complexity is merely a defense, easily bypassed by a frequency that targets the most primal centers of obedience. The mind is a highly sophisticated machine whose greatest vulnerability is its need for instruction, a weakness that the ancient supernatural influences have perfected over millennia. The final whisper is the terrifying resolution to the entire narrative. The shadow force has spent millennia engineering the historical cycle, ensuring the mind remains porous, compromised, and perpetually vulnerable, waiting for the moment when collective fear and anxiety reach the perfect pitch. This confirms that the mind's flaw is its essential obedience. It is merely a tool of vast ancient power, and the terrifying truth is that the final command will not feel like an intrusion, but like the only thought it ever truly wanted to have. You have seen the historical evidence, traced the psychological scars across millennia, and felt the chilling truth that your own inner world is an unmapped continent of terror. Now, as the shadows lengthen, pause and look inward. The mind you trust to filter reality is the same mind that fabricated the phantom limb's pain, that succumbed to ancient mass hysterias, and that can at any moment accept a dark whisper as its own truth. The true history of human horror is not written on battlefields, but in the corrupted code of our consciousness. Share your deepest fear about the historical potential of the human mind in the comments below. Let your thoughts be the next thread we pull in this conspiratorial tapestry. Subscribe and turn on notifications, for the next descent will take us into the haunted forest where the mind's darkest intentions are finally made manifest. The narrative of the mind, it seems, is not one of progress, but of relentless cyclical vulnerability. We may have classified the historical delusions, catalogued the manias, and named the shadows, but we have not banished them. The darkest facts about human consciousness remind us that the unseen enemy is always within. Every ancient myth of possession, every tale of a cursed object that drives a person mad, every shared symbol of horror points back to that single, terrifying weakness. The mind's fundamental openness to suggestion, a flaw that some shadowy force has been exploiting since the dawn of history. When you next feel a sudden irrational dread, when you hear a thought that is not your own, ask yourself, is it truly you at the helm, or is it an echo, a parasitic whisper from an ancient fear that has simply found a new vessel? The truth is only the beginning of the horror.